My name's Steve Weissman, and this class is, I think you know, is called Energy Regulation in the Environment. And I want to just introduce myself a little bit and then go around and have each of you introduce yourselves a little bit as well. I've taught this class 5 times before, 3 times. This will be my 3rd time here. And it's been an interesting experience because the level of awareness of energy issues has changed so dramatically just in that short period of time. This initial day would be a very different discussion, I think, if we got together even 2 years ago or 3 years ago. But there's I think, a growing understanding of the role, the very significant role that energy issues play, not only in terms of the environment, but also in terms of the way the world functions, in terms of political alliances and economics, and the way that business is able to thrive or not thrive in different places. And as I say, this awareness is changing a whole lot. It's kind of nice for somebody like me to see because I've been involved in this field for a long time. My current work, other than teaching here and teaching in one other place I'll tell you about in a minute, my current job is to serve as an administrative law judge for the California Public Utilities Commission. And within the next couple of classes, I'll talk a lot more about what the PUC is and how it functions. But just to try to briefly explain what I do as an administrative law judge, among other things, the Public Utilities Commission regulates all of the privately owned gas and electric utilities, also telephone, transportation, some private water utilities. There are 5 commissioners that are appointed by the governor, and they serve 6-year terms. And but at any particular time, there are probably about 500 different formal proceedings pending before the commission, and those 5 commissioners can't preside over all of those. So I preside over administrative hearings. I sit up on the bench and rule on motions and take in evidence, and then and listen to live testimony. And when all that is done, I sit back in the privacy of my own office and write a long proposed decision related to that particular proceeding, and then I hand it over to the 5 commissioners, and they decide what to do about it. So that's what I do as an administrative law judge. In addition to that, I've served as a policy advisor to several commissioners at the PUC. I spent a short period of time at the state legislature as a consultant to the Assembly Committee on Natural Resources in Sacramento. Did work with a nonprofit called the Local Government Commission, which is located in Sacramento, and has a lot of elected officials who are members of that organization. And the Local Government Commission creates policy documents, policy proposals, suggested actions for people to take on that level. And I think it covers a lot of the bases in terms of what I've been doing over the last few years. And so I guess the one other thing I ought to mention before I turn it over to you and ask you to introduce yourselves is that you may know that those of you who were here in prior years have sure noticed that this room has changed a lot in the last year. They changed the kind of surface of the desks, and they put in chairs. But the other thing they did is that they added equipment that allows classes in this room to be videotaped and then potentially webcast. And you may all know about that, but if you don't, when the people realized that we were going to be in this room, they asked me if I'd be willing to webcast this course. And I wasn't quite ready to say we'd webcast it, but I did agree that we'd go through the first couple of sessions and allow them to be videotaped. And then the videos for these first 2 lectures, at a minimum, will be available on the class website. And whether we go broader than the class website or not is something we'll figure out over the course of time. But because of that, that's why I'm wearing this microphone. And also I'm going to ask you to use the microphone as well when you're speaking.
You sit there and hold it like 2 hours analysis.
That's right. That's right. And we're going to be having stupid pet tricks and stupid people tricks, especially stupid people tricks. We're going to get a lot of those from up here, and so you guys have to contribute as well. All right. So Max, why don't we start with you? What I'd like to have you do is just introduce yourself and explain why you're here. And you don't have to have a very creative explanation, but I just want to know who everybody is and what you're doing here.
I'm Vidon, I guess. I'm
Yeah.
Max, and from Sonoma County. I'm in law school because my friend Dustin told me I needed to go to law school to friends who had graduated from what we're going to do in the world. And I'm in this class because I want just a broad survey of this topic, and would highly recommend it by folks who take it seriously.
Okay. All right, thanks. Yeah, might as well go that way and we'll get back over here.
Because I don't know much about energy, but I think it's very relevant and important. I think I know a lot, so.
Welcome.
I'm Jason. I'm a 3L.
Maybe what it really was is they just wanted you to have to go through it too. It might be, it's hard to tell when you get those recommendations. Jonathan?
My name's Jonathan. I'm 3L, and yes,
Great.
My name's Eric. I'm a 3L, and I'm taking this course.
It's just a little louder.
Oh, okay. I know Berkeley is really kind of well
Uh-huh.
so
Oh, good. Well, thank you. Welcome. Yeah, I would not assume that it's going to actually amplify you very much, but because I actually tried to turn it down fairly low because I don't really think we needed much amplification in here, but it'll be heard. It'll be heard hopefully for the recording.
My name is Monisha Kala. I'm studying from Japan. I have been practicing law for 3.5 years, and one of my first jobs as a lawyer was equity finance electric company. And when I was doing that, I learned a lot of derivation. I learned that Japanese a kind of tracing U.S. derivation, and also maybe both by
Mm-hmm.
and so I want to learn the future.
Okay, so did I hear you talking about both regulation and deregulation? Did I hear you say that? Yeah, that's important because we're going to talk a lot about the way energy has been regulated over most of the last century and how that's been changing lately with efforts to move away from regulation. So that's an important part of what we'll be discussing. Thank you. Welcome. Oh, it's a mic. Actually, all right. Maybe Theo can help. You almost got away with it. It was really close.
Should we test it? Is that?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica, and
Jessica.
I'm here as to reflect what a lot of the other students have said. Just really want to expand my knowledge in the field of energy, and I am interested in environmental and other types of law, including international, and think this will be a great place to start. I am also a 1L. So.
Meet you.
My name is Vanessa. I am a LLM student as well. I am from Mexico City, and I'm in this class because what I do in Mexico is precisely energy and environmental law, and I want to learn more on how energy is regulated in the U.S.
Well, great. It's really good to have you.
My name is Rich. I'm a 1L, and in this class because my ASP tutor last semester recommended and said it was a pretty good class, so check it out.
Great.
Hi, my name is Sok. I'm also a first year here, and I just thought it would be an interesting course to take.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Katie. I am a third-year student, and I'm taking this class because I wanted to take environmental law at some point, and this is my last chance, and the course description looked really interesting.
Hi, my name is Rebecca. I'm a 3L. And the reason I'm taking the class is I've been working for a small transactional firm in San Francisco where I'll be working upon graduation, and we have a really large alternative energies practice. So I thought it would be really useful for that.
Which firm?
Green Rudofsky. Mark Hennig. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
I came in late, so what are we?
Just recite on the first three cases, and then we'll. No.
Gotcha.
You can just introduce yourself
Which-
and explain why you're here. That's all.
I'm Josh. I'm actually a 4L. So because I'm a joint degree student in law and public policy.
Ah.
So it's my last semester. And I have yet to take any class related to this topic whatsoever.
This is good. Okay.
So.
All right. Good. Thanks. Welcome, Josh. And Karen probably just will wave her hand. Karen is actually. Are you still? No. Where are you right now? You're just applied, right? So she's inspecting. So do a good job. Okay.
I'm Steve. I'm a 2L, and I'm really interested in alternative energy and project finance. So there you go.
I'm Elaine. I'm a 2L and primarily interested in climate change related issues, which obviously energy has a lot to do with. So that's why I'm here.
Hi, I'm Tim. I'm a 2L. I'm from Waukesha, Wisconsin. And I like the idea of energy law because it seems to be the only part of environmental law that's actually forward-looking. It's not looking to punish someone who did something bad. It's actually looking to make things kind of better. And I like that idea of it.
Okay. Wait. Take the punishment stuff out. Is what you're saying? Okay. All right.
My name's Jason. I'm a 1L. And this litigation sounds boring to me, and this sounds much cooler. So I'm here.
Hi, my name is Martin. I'm a 3L, and my last summer I had an assignment on fuel efficiency standards, and I found it really interesting, so I decided to check this class out.
My name is Tyler. I'm a 1L, and I'm here because I guess because I've just sort of been turned on by all the buzz about alternative energy and climate change, that kind of thing, and I really want to get involved with it while I'm in law school.
Thanks. Did you say what year you're in?
I'm a 1L.
You're 1L?
I'm Michelle. I'm from Appleton, Wisconsin. And
Well, Tim, Michelle, I see.
I'm interested in the topic and wanted to learn more.
Okay. Good. Oh, you have one of those already. You don't have one of these.
Hi, I'm Brian. I'm a 1L, and I'm here because I used to do a little bit of transactional stuff, and we had some energy companies we worked with, and I didn't understand a thing of it. So this is a good place to start, I think.
I'm Peter. I'm a 1L, and right before we signed up for classes, I saw the documentary on Enron, and I thought this was interesting and a good fit.
Hi, I'm Tanya. I'm a 1L. I know very little about energy law, so I'm just curious to learn more.
Erica, did you get a chance yet, Erica? Oh, well, you can start then. That's good. Fine.
I'm Sarah. I'm really involved with BERC, which is Berkeley Energy Resources Collaborative, and also want to throw that out as a pitch for if anyone is interested already in energy or this class makes you interested in energy. We have a special BERC at Bolt chapter. I would love to add any of all of you to the email list and learn what we're doing with that. But I'm really excited about it, and I know very little of the regulation aspect, so to learn more.
I'm Andrew. I'm a 2L. I used to be a coastal engineer. I did a lot of work for oil companies, and I'm kind of curious how the regulatory side works.
My name is Erica. I'm also 1L, and I've been interested in energy for a while, particularly climate change, and I have a little bit of a background in energy efficiency. That's what I worked on at my old job before law school.
My name is Kevin. I'm LM student from Taiwan. I'm interested in environmental law and energy law because my home country is a small island. We face a shortage of stable energy supply. So our government consider to proposed a draft about Renewable Energy Act. So I'm interested about renewable energy. Thank you.
Welcome.
Hi, my name is Patrice. I'm an exchange student from Australia. I just took a really interesting environmental economics course here. We did a lot on oil depletion, so I thought I'd like to take this one and learn the law side of it.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Christopher Williams. Excuse me. I'm a 1L. In my last job, I was working in China for an environmental law firm, doing research about renewables, efficiency power plants, and clean buildings. And I think that energy is the field that I'm headed to as far as law goes, and I think it makes the most dramatic importance as far as changing our environment, things like that. So.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Harry. I'm also a 1L and also involved with Burke, as are several other people here. It's a good group of people. I am, I think, in general, concerned with the sustainability of 20th century culture, and I'm hoping to be part of the effort in the 21st century to build something better, and this is definitely a field where that's important, so I want to learn about it.
Thank you. So Andrew, did you say hello already? Okay. So again, everybody had a chance to air their grievances? Good. All right, thank you. I've listened very closely to the reasons all of you gave for being in the class, and they were all the right reasons. So it's really great to see all of you here. This is really intended to be a class that could fill two different kinds of niches. One would be if somebody's been involved in the field in one form or another. It had something to do with energy on some level, whether it's transactional work or something else. And yet they've just sort of seen one little toe on the elephant. Then hopefully this class will give you an opportunity to see the rest of the elephant. And if, on the other hand, if you come in either not knowing anything about energy, not even knowing if you're interested in it, if you come in with a total blank slate, which I don't think there are too many blank slates at Bolt, to tell you the truth. But if you do come in with absolutely no impressions at all right, this will give you an opportunity to walk through things from the beginning all the way through. Has anybody in this class taken any of the energy resources group classes? Dan Kammen's introductory class to energy, for instance. Okay, that's actually also good, because this class will have a little bit of overlap with that class, and I think it's probably better from a law student perspective to take this one first and then decide if you wanted to get any more exposure to the issues on that level. Well, I'm going to talk a fair amount about how the course is going to work, but before I get into that, I think I thought it might be interesting to just look at some of the things that have been happening in the news just in the last week. Let's see, where should I start? On January 15th, federal officials disclosed a variety of lapses in the inspections that take place at the San Onofre nuclear plant. There's a nuclear plant down in Southern California. There are 2 units to that plant that are still in operation, about 2,000 megawatts. We'll talk about what that means in a few minutes, too. And nuclear plants, as you probably can imagine, require a tremendous amount of vigilance. One of the things they need, one of the fears that they have is fire, because there's a lot of equipment that could catch fire for one reason or another. And it turned out that for the last 5 years, the people who were supposed to be doing the fire inspections were supposed to do the inspections and then sign a little report that says we did them. Well, it turns out they were signing the report, but they weren't doing the inspections. And so that's of great concern, as you can imagine, to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is a federal agency that regulates that field. And so they're going to require some mandatory training, and they're going to try to be a little more disciplined in terms of tracking what's going on there. Katie? Yeah, well, the inspectors are either direct employees of the company, the utility that owns the power plant, or they're contractors hired by the utility. With a lot of these efforts to check the quality of what's going on at a utility plant, there will be expectations set forth by the regulators as to how they do it. But then they'll require the utilities to actually police themselves on the first level. So that's what's going on there. Good question. Now let's go to Fresno. What happened in Fresno? There was a blackout and left 28,000 people in the dark. This also coincidentally was in the news on January 15th. The subheading there was, Curiosity Killed the Cat. And nearly 28,000 PG&E employees in Fresno were without power for about 2 hours on Monday. So what happened? Well, the cat was walking along some lines and got a little excited, and its tail was touching one line and its nose touched another line, and that was the end of the cat. But it also took down the electric power with it. The outage began about 11:40 after a cat climbed onto a piece of equipment at PG&E's substation, etc. The power was out between West Avenue and Highway 99. There were numerous reports of homes, businesses, intersections, schools that were without power. Lunch hour traffic was backed up at major intersections affected by the outage. And Sergeant John Chandler of the Fresno Police Traffic Bureau reported that there were a few accidents that occurred in that area as well. Now let's move to the federal government. The Energy Information Agency, you're going to hear about them a little bit during the course of this course. It's part of the Federal Department of Energy that prepares reports on various energy issues. And this is a report that they issued on Tuesday. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that October 2007 was the 9th warmest October on the record for the contiguous United States. And as a result of that, the number of cooling days, the amount of energy, time that had to be spent trying to cool homes and businesses as opposed to warming them up, was much higher than it normally would be. According to the Federal Reserve Board, industrial production was 1.4% higher than it had been in October of the previous year. The higher temperatures and rise in production led to a net generation total that was 3.4% higher than it was the prior year. Net electric generation, meaning that there was 3.4% more electricity generated in October of 2007 than there was in October 2006. And a lot of the reason was just because it was warmer that October than it had been in the prior October. Let's zip up to Alberta, Canada. Alberta, does anybody know what the primary energy production is in Alberta, California? What the product is that's being produced? Anybody tell me that? Oil sands. And can you explain briefly what oil sands are?
I don't really know that well, but it's like a kind of like more difficult kind of oil to extract and kind of get into Texas.
Right. We'll be talking about oil sands in more detail in a few weeks. It's basically, this is sand which has trapped a lot of oil, and in order to get the oil out of the sand, you have to wash the sand, basically, and extract the oil. It's a very energy-intensive way to produce oil. There happens to be a tremendous amount of that up in Alberta. And so the Alberta Premier had a comment to make, and what he said was he's concerned that the climate initiatives in the United States might lead to reduced demand for the Alberta oil sands products in the United States. Especially of concern is the kind of thing that's happening in California, where California is trying to reduce the carbon content of fuel, right? And so they're saying, well, if you do that, then you're probably going to need less of our relatively high carbon oil. Not only high carbon when you burn it, but it's very high carbon to produce it because it's so much energy goes into pulling it out of the ground. So they're concerned that may ultimately reduce their revenues, but also that it could reduce, their argument is it could reduce energy security in the United States because it would mean that it'd have to be more of a reliance on getting oil somewhere else. There actually, as you can see, I have many additional pages of things that just happened in the last few days. What I wanted to do is just give you a taste of the fact that there's a very broad dialogue, discussion going on about energy issues. It's a worldwide discussion right now. It touches on all kinds of different bases, the kind of electric utility things that we're likely to talk about more in this class, and transportation issues, and the way that industrial facilities are able to produce their goods. This kind of dialogue is going on everywhere, and one of the things I'm going to ask you to do in this class is to pay attention to what's going on in the news in terms of energy. And at the beginning of each class, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about things that have come up in the week prior to our last meeting, because hopefully I want you to get an understanding, if you don't have it already, of just how consistently these issues are coming to public attention now. Again, for someone that's been in the field a long time, it's nice to see because it hasn't always been that way. And I guess the other thing I'd like to emphasize about these kinds of stories is that some of them sound fairly local, but the reality is that almost all of them have an impact on people, whether they're in a particular community in California, in some other state, or in some other country. And we're going to talk a lot about those connections during the course of the semester. Colleagues of mine who teach similar classes in other places like to talk about the existence of what they refer to as a trilemma. When you look at energy issues, there are at least three challenges that you wind up facing. Of course, there are environmental challenges in terms of the energy choices we make, and that's, I think, why a lot of us are here. But there are also security issues that are arisen over energy use. And those things are often in conflict. For instance, from a national security basis, we'd be a whole lot better off if we use a lot more coal and a lot less oil. And I think we'll also find during the course of the semester, we'd be better off if we used more coal than if we used more natural gas. We're going to find out that natural gas doesn't pollute as much as oil does. It certainly doesn't pollute as much as coal does, but we're starting to run out of natural gas in the United States, and we have known for several years that we don't have enough oil to take care of everybody's needs in the United States. So when we rely on bringing in natural gas or bringing in oil from other countries, then we wind up bringing a whole lot of implications into this that we might not have wanted to have to deal with. One of the I think more interesting examples of that right now is what's going on in terms of the relationship between the United States and Russia. Remember, there used to be the Soviet Union, and during the time that the Soviet Union existed, there was considered to be a Cold War going on for decades. And that ended, the Berlin Wall came down, and the Soviet Empire crumbled, and Russia became a fairly humble country for a little bit of time. Not so humble anymore. If you look in the news, you can see that Putin, who's still in charge right now, has gotten a little more and more bold as time has gone by, and he's started to become very critical of the United States. He's started to be a little more bold in terms of developing alliances with other countries that could potentially be working against U.S. interest in one area or another. Why is this happening? What's happening for one reason. He did one very smart thing. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the energy interests in the country, the oil resources, natural gas resources, went into private hands. And then and there was a small cadre of people who were extracting a lot of wealth out of this process. Well, the first thing that happened is that Putin took over control of those energy interests again, the oil interests and the gas interests. The second thing that happened was something he couldn't have controlled very well, and that's that oil and gas prices started going really high. Where's the oil price now? Oil is priced at close to $100 a barrel. Well, it's quite a bit lower when all of this started. Natural gas prices, we're going to find, have also changed tremendously. What used to cost $2.50 and stayed at that level for 10, 15 years is now up at $7 instead of $2.50, and it fluctuates a lot and tends to go higher in times of crisis. And so Russia is now collecting all this revenue. Suddenly, their economy is looking darn good, and almost all of it has to do with energy. And you can have a similar conversation about various other countries. Certainly, I think it's probably obvious to a lot of people that that's what's been going on in the Middle East for a number of years, but it's starting to happen in South America, and it's happening in other parts of the former Soviet Union as well. So now what happens when that occurs is that not only does the power balance of power shift between countries, but it also creates situations where the United States doesn't want to tick somebody off because they need to rely on their resources. You've probably heard the struggle a lot about, why is it that we're so concerned about the way of life in Iraq, and yet the way of life in Saudi Arabia is something you don't hear the president talking about a whole lot. And again, where we have our energy alliances has a lot to do with that. So those are two two wings of the trilemma. You can see where the environmental factors, you don't want to use coal because it's very dirty, and the national security factors might be in conflict. But then what's the third factor? Well, the third factor is, I guess you could categorize it as opportunity. Access to energy creates opportunity. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. Let me see if I can pull up a couple of graphics that can kind of move us through some of this. Let's for the minute put opportunity aside, and we'll get to it again. But I want to put the environmental implications of our energy use in a little bit more perspective. I asked you as part of the first class to look at a website for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Somebody was kind enough to point out to me that since I put out that first syllabus, the link has changed a little bit. Hopefully, if you look for it, you were able to find it. You can click through each one of the fuel resources and get a sense of what kind of environmental implications come from choosing one resource over another. And if you haven't done that yet, I encourage you to go back and look at that website. But this is one of many oversimplifications I'm going to offer you, because I don't want to try to give you precision on these things. I want to give you a taste of order of magnitude. Right, so the question is, where are the major sources of air pollution in the United States? And as you can see from this graphic, about a third of the pollution comes from transportation, a third from power plants, and a third from other places. Well, let's look at the power plants for a second. 3,000 power plants. There really are more now. The number is growing as time goes by, but it gives you a relative sense of what's going on. The interesting thing is that it's really a small portion of that, about 10% of the plants, that are really responsible for the vast majority of the air pollution that's occurring from power production. Those are obviously the older plants, or the ones that don't have as much environmental control over them. They're not as efficient as the other ones. And you can see that according to the estimate of the people who put this graphic together, about 90% of the air pollution comes from about 300 of the plants, about 10% of the power plants. So I think it's pretty tempting to just close down the class. Let's all just go out with baseball bats and find those 300 plants and whack them to bits. And we ought to be in a lot better shape. If only life were that simple. But now I want to also talk about opportunity, but from one particular angle. Let's look at the United States. This is a kind of complex graphic to look at, and I'm going to make these available on the website. If you want to spend some time studying it later, you're welcome to do that. But the overall message here is that the areas that have a box of one sort or another are called areas of non-attainment. Anybody know what a non-attainment area is? The federal government. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Max. Explain.
Oh.
Yeah.
So you're out of compliance with the Clean Air Act's or anyone they regulate ozone or particular matter. If you're non-attaining, I think you're not meeting the concentration of the national ambient air quality standards.
Good. Yeah, you got the Federal Clean Air Act, and under that Clean Air Act, the Environmental Protection Agency and then various state agencies that implement that on behalf of the federal government establish standards and say, look, for each of these certain criteria air pollutants, you shouldn't really allow any more emissions than this amount. Okay, so if you're below that, you're in attainment. If you're above it, you're non-attainment. It means you're polluting too much. Okay, so if you look at that map, all the areas that have a box are non-attainment areas. And the darker the box, the higher percentage of the people living in that area who are Latinos. So as you can see, there are some areas, there are a number of areas in the Midwest and the Near East where there are some boxes that aren't terribly dark. But if you look at Southern California, the Central Valley, and parts of the Atlantic seaboard, there are places of very high, relatively high population, Latino population that have very dirty air. And this becomes obviously a huge equity issue. We're not going to talk about climate change right now. But But the notion of opportunity not only is really related to this concept of whether we're disproportionately putting the burden of our environmental damage on people from one group as opposed to people from another group, but it also has to do in a very big way with the opportunities that people have in other parts of the world. I hope that you may realize that at this point there are still billions of people on this planet who do not have electricity in their homes. And on some days that sounds really very appealing to me and may feel that way to you as well. But the fact of the matter is that if you don't have electricity, it's much less likely that you're going to be literate, among other things. Now, how does that work? Well, especially let's look at women who have to take care of a household all day long and want to become literate. When are they going to read? They're going to read when their kids go to bed. And if you don't have electricity, you got to do it by candlelight, and it's not a very easy thing to do. And so there's not the kind of incentive that you'd have otherwise. And I've got graphics that I'll probably breeze through later that show you that in various countries outside the United States, there's a very strong relationship between the kind of energy you have access to and literacy. Well, also let's talk about a little bit about China. First time I've said the word, we're going to be saying it a lot in this class. We're going to be talking about China because in some ways, right now, you look at China where it's claimed that there's a new coal plant, a coal-fired power plant being added every week. If you look at China, it's like you're looking at the United States 150 years ago, but you're doing it from the perspective of knowing what we know today, right? And we're looking, look at the United States 150 years ago, and look at people starting to go around trying to find ways to harness water power from flowing rivers, and then dealing with coal initially, and then moving up through electric generation. And wouldn't you like to be able to say, stop? There's all sorts of problems ahead. Let's not go down this route. Let's not deal so much with these you know the phrase fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are oil and natural gas and coal. Let's not focus so much on fossil fuels. Let's try to deal with renewables. Well, that's China today, because China is blossoming economically on an hour-to-hour basis, and it's being manifest mostly in the fact that the entire country is becoming electrified, one community at a time, and there are tremendous energy projects that are still on the drawing board. Well, why do we care about that? Because as of today, the United States is still the largest producer of greenhouse gases. But we're not going to have that honor much longer. Pretty soon, China is going to catch up. In fact, they're going to catch up, and then they're going to go ahead of us. All right, now, with China and other countries that have been referred to as third world countries for many decades, they don't want to hear much from the United States right now about being high and mighty about pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, because the United States has had a free ride for a really long time. Why shouldn't everybody else want to catch up? Not in terms of pollution, but in terms of the benefits that come from a more vibrant economy and from having the opportunity to have those TVs and cars and consumer products and everything else that they've been seeing and hearing about for so long. So you have from the vantage point of somebody in China or somebody in an African country that's now just anticipating the notion of having electric wires run out to their villages, you see energy as an opportunity. You see it as a way, potentially a great equalizer. From an environmental perspective, you see that notion of having that equal opportunity as being one that if it isn't managed properly, could just lead to an uncontrollable disaster. Not only in terms of criteria, air pollutants, but in terms of greenhouse gases, in terms of the temperature of the planet. So we've got this trilemma, and we've got to figure out how, from a public policy standpoint, we can deal with it. Well, I probably don't have to tell any of you that lawyers are not only going to have a key role in this kind of discussion, but they do have a key role in it now, and so this kind of course, I think, is an opportunity to a move away from the kind of skill building you do in the bar kind of classes to start getting a sense of what you can do as a practicing attorney or as somebody with a law degree who's going to do something else. You know, what I tell a lot of people about that the benefit of being a lawyer is, as far as I'm concerned, is you get paid to learn all the time. And it's interesting because the classes that we normally take in law school are, are usually kind of structured toward learning a particular discipline. It's usually relatively narrow. But you never practice a narrow discipline when you get outside of law school. You wind up doing something that's applied to something or another. And in order to do it well, in order to stand up and be able to speak on behalf of a client, for instance, or to uncover an injustice and figure out what to do about it, you need to understand the underlying concepts that are involved in that field. So if it's a civil rights thing, you have to understand what's going on in communities and understand relative economics and things like that. If it's energy, you have to understand a lot of things about the way energy works. And so this class is going to be different than classes a lot of you have taken, because of the fact that it's not going to be just strictly looking at statutes, strictly looking at cases. There's a brochure that CCELP puts out. CCELP is the California Center for Environmental Law and Policy, which is the environmental law center here. And they try to explain what they're trying to do. And I want to read you a couple of quick paragraphs because I think it really captures what we're trying to do here. For environmental lawyers, it's not sufficient to master substantive environmental law and administrative procedure. They must also understand public policy analysis, the interaction of law, economics, and science, the normative basis for environmental protection, and the political and bureaucratic dimensions of environmental law and policy. Environmental lawyers must be sensitive to the broad social, economic, and political realities that underlie this area of the law. The curriculum is concerned not only with the basic legal elements, statutes, regulations, and cases, but also with the broader structure of environmental law and policy. The program prepares students to navigate the existing regulatory system as well as to contribute to the ongoing process of reform. That, I think, describes this kind of class to a T, because we're going to not only do law, we're also going to do a smidgen of economics. We're going to talk a little bit today about engineering, and we're going to talk a lot about public policy. And as I say, if you're going to practice in this field on any level, whether it's transactional, whether it's from working for a government agency, whether it's just advising clients on other private issues related to this, you're going to have to understand the policy. You're going to have to understand a little bit about how these physical systems work as well. And hopefully, you'll see in a couple of weeks, it makes sense to know a little bit about the economics related to these areas as well. So when you get done with this, hopefully, where are you going to be? Well, you're going to be, I think you're certainly going to be a couple of steps beyond where a well-read generalist might be who spends some time looking at energy issues. You'll be able to attend a conference on an energy-related subject and make sense of it in a very different way. Read an article in a trade magazine related to energy issues. Read a key decision from a federal district court, maybe in this area, and be able to understand what it's all about. You certainly be in a position to walk in and interview at any firm or government agency that works in this area, and people are going to pay attention to you in a different kind of way. We've seen that. Again, this is only the third time we've gone through this at Volt, but we've seen that happen with a large number of the people who've been in the other classes. And I think, frankly, that you'd be in a position, if you went into this kind of job, to hit the ground running. In other words, you wouldn't have to get that orientation that's so hard for people in a new field to get a lot of times. You never go into anything related to energy at all in your life. At least you'll have created a new area where you've got perspective that you might not have had before. So how are we going to do this? Well, first of all, just briefly to describe the way the course is laid out. First, we're going to lay a foundation. Today, we'll talk about what electricity is, what it is as a physical thing, and how the industry itself functions. We'll talk about how electricity is generated and delivered. We'll talk about what regulation is all about, what the economic underpinnings are of regulation. We're going to talk about how you set rates, specifically electric rates. And we'll talk about where the line is drawn between what state regulators do and what federal regulators do. I should have emphasized up till now something that's emphasized in the description in the syllabus, which is that we're talking about energy. We're going to talk broadly about a lot of energy issues. We'll talk about some transportation fuels, and we'll talk about other things. But primarily, the way we're going to get at this is going to be through looking at electricity. And electricity is a good field to look at for a few reasons. One is this kind of reason, the fact that you've got a third of the pollution we're concerned about coming from electric power plants. Where do you want to start when you're going to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for instance? Do you want to start with millions of vehicles that are traveling the roads in different directions, using different fuels, making different decisions? Do you want to start with the other third of disaggregated kind of sources, running the gamut from industrial plants to barbecues in the backyard? Or do you want to start with power plants, which are fixed in the ground, they're very large, they're subject to regulation for various purposes? I'm loading the question here, aren't I? You want to start with power plants because they're the place, I think, where you have the chance for the quickest gain and the surest gain. Elaine? You know, this is a slide that was pre Al Gore, I guess is the best way to put it. So it's not focusing on that so much. It's really looking at the criteria of pollutants. But the relative magnitudes are pretty much the same. But it depends where you are and what part of the country you're in. For instance, we're in California, and I think hopefully you're going to learn that there are a lot of really wonderful exemplary programs going on in California to reduce the emissions from power plants. But you're also going to find, I think, that electricity in California is a lot less of a carbon producer than electricity in a lot of other places. And again, we'll be talking about how that happens as well. Good question. So we're going to look at these fundamentals. And then the other thing that looking at electricity does, I think, is it allows you to then examine a lot of other fuels. Because we're going to find out that in order to make electricity, you have to use energy. You have to take something that's going to be used to generate electricity, whether it's oil or natural gas or coal or nuclear power or wind turbines or geothermal or hydroelectric, any one of these various sources, you have to use those resources in order to produce the electricity. And all of them have an interesting story to tell, all of themselves. Let me talk about natural gas just for a second, because natural gas is not only something that's used as a boiler fuel in power plants, it's also used for heating our hot water and for various industrial purposes. It's a utility energy product all in of itself. And so it's got its own regulatory history, and we're going to learn from that regulatory history by looking at that fuel a little bit. So we're going to march through the various fuels. And then we're going to look at renewable energy. We're going to look at energy efficiency and demand response. And then throughout this process, we're going to focus on regulatory tools. We're going to try to build a tool chest, understand what the entities like the one I work for now, what they have, options they have available to them to try to deal with things like climate change. And I will say this now. This is the secret for the final and everything else. That this is all about trying to build that tool chest, understand what the tools are that regulators can use to try to deal with these environmental problems, to shape public policy. And then you mentioned deregulation earlier. We're going to look at how electric utilities have been regulated up till now, and how they're, frankly, largely still regulated that way. But also how there's been a trend toward deregulation and what that's meant. So in order to build that case, we're going to spend time looking at the historical underpinnings for energy regulation, and we're going to look at the way it evolved over the course of time as legislators and courts started looking at the way we were regulating and making adjustments. And then we're going to look at the deregulation movement, which really largely started in the late 80s, early 90s. Well, why are we doing all of that? Why are we looking at the historical part? Because everything that's happening now is informed by what happened in the 20th century, and also because a lot of the elements of the 20th century regulation are still very much in place, even in the states that think they've deregulated. And unless we understand what those elements are of traditional regulation, we're not going to be in a position to understand how they still have an influence over what's happening. Okay? So we're going to move through that. And then we'll end the class by looking specifically at policy related to climate change and trying to figure out how to take that tool chest we developed and apply it to trying to deal with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, let me just say a little bit about what I'm going to expect from you in the class, and then after that I want to open this up for questions about the substance of the class, where it's going to go, or the way we're going to handle it procedurally. There's a fair amount of reading, although believe me, those of you who are here now are in much better shape than those of you who took the class a couple of years ago. Before the class started, Alice walked in, and she's still talking to me, which is a great thing, because they had a lot to read when she took the class, and I've tapered it down quite a bit. The other thing that's different from the way the class was the first time around, there was a course reader about that thick. It was in 3 volumes, and it cost about $115. This semester, there is no course reader. Thank you. Thank you very much. It actually took a bit of work to get there, but that's where we are. And how do we get to that point? Well, largely by relying on things that are in the public domain or that you can get access to on Westlaw or Lexis. So here's the way things are going to work. If you haven't done so already, go to the bookstore. You'll find this book sitting there called Energy Law in a Nutshell. It's a nice book. It's actually a decent one to have on your shelf for reference purposes at other times. It's less than $30, and this we'll use for trying to get an introduction, for instance, to a lot of those different fuels that I mentioned, those boiler fuels, but also for next week, for instance, you'll be reading a chapter about regulatory economics in here. So we'll be using this fairly often. There's also, in addition to that, there's also what I listed as a recommended book, and it's this one, The End of Oil, by Paul Roberts. This book, obviously, from the title, you guess it focuses fundamentally on oil, on the big granddaddy of all the fossil fuels, and what's happened to its use over time, and what the implications are of relying on it. But actually, the book is much broader. It's got chapters in here that not only talk about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but also talk about renewable energy and energy efficiency, and help to weave together the political strains that I was alluding to earlier that come from this shifting dependence on energy resources in different countries. So I recommend to read it. I won't be talking about it much in class. I think you'll probably enjoy it. So if all your classes in your normal reading load aren't enough, you can add this book to that. If you decide to read it, let me know. I'd like to know whether anybody's working through it, but it's certainly not mandatory. It will provide a really good context, and it's very readable. So again, the rest of the material is either on the web in one form or another, or on reserve in the library. There are 3 things that are on reserve in the library, and you'll see them referred to in here. There's one book where I wanted to have you read 2 chapters. Instead of asking you to buy the chapters, I put a couple of copies on reserve, on course reserve. And then there are a couple of other things that fit in that category as well. There's going to be one day where I'm going to ask you to look at a utility's plan for its resource development in the next 10 years. And you've got access to it electronically, but I thought it might be more comforting to leaf through the pages, so I got a couple of copies of that on reserve. So there are things that are like that. When you work through the syllabus, it ought to be clear when you get to each thing. If it should either say it's in one of the books I talked about, or it should say it's on the web, or if it says nothing, you basically have to go find it. And going find it will probably mean you're dealing with a case, and you go to Westlaw and you download it if you want to. I will also say, though, that for most of the cases, you don't even have to do that if you don't want to, because here's what I've done. We've set up a BSpace. I don't know if any of you have not seen the BSpace yet, but there's a BSpace for this course. It actually does have the syllabus. I know some people have gone on and thought they didn't see the syllabus. Basically, it takes a few seconds to load the syllabus. And if you're like me, you click on a page and then you see it stay blank and you say, well, there's nothing here, then you move on. If you actually wait a minute, the syllabus will download. Also, there's a PDF version of the syllabus that's at the very end. So if you scroll down to the bottom, you can get to that. By the way, since I mentioned syllabus, I've got about 20 copies of the syllabus here too. So if anybody wants to grab that and have a physical copy, you're welcome to do that. But on the BSpace, I will have a section for each day's class, and I think it's under resources, and you'll see the readings for that class that either are not available on the web, so I have to put them up someplace where you can get them, or if in the case of the cases I'm having you read, most of them I've edited them down. I know that's not intellectually pure, and I don't feel very good about it. But on the other hand, I figured if I did that, you'd actually get more things you can read. Instead of having to dwell on 2 cases, you could read 3 or 4. So it's up to you. You want to download the whole case from Westlaw? More power to you. If you want to read an edited version, you can take what I'm going to have up on the web. Okay, and so those are the things that need to be read. I will expect, number one, I'll expect people to be in class. And number 2, I'll expect people who have done the reading. It will be a participatory class, a very heavily participatory class. And I think you'll find it more rewarding that way. I look forward to coming to each session of this class because it's stimulating for me. I get to sit up here and stand up here and have you guys tell me things I never even thought of before because you're engaged in the subject. And the only way that works is if you do the readings and then you show up. And this is one of those, I remember my brother went to law school. He went to law school 2 years before I did. And so he had words of wisdom for me when I started. And all he said to me was, keep up. Just keep up. It won't be that hard. Just don't get yourself at the end of the semester and have to do. Well, this is one of those classes. Just keep up. And everything's going to be great. And we'll have a good time together. But don't try to save too much for yourself at the end. Because the grade will be composed as follows. It'll be 25% based on class participation. And again, you can't participate if you're not here. So I'm going to want you to be in class. There are going to be 4 things I'm referring to as take-home assignments. 3 of them are required, and the 4th is optional. Let me break down. One of the required ones is a small group project. By the way, none of this requires research, so it's all based on materials we're covering in the class. The small group project will have to do with designing utility rates to try to influence behavior of utility customers. And so I'll encourage you to break into groups of maybe as many as 3 people to produce those. And then 2 of them are papers, small papers. And they relate to what we're covering on the day that the papers are due. So for instance, the first one, and I'll hand out to you before you leave today, the 4 assignments so you can look at them. For one of the assignments, there will be a series of cases that you're going to be asked to read, to talk about in class on day X. Well, due that day will be a short paper discussing the evolution of the law through those cases. And so that'll be one of the papers. There's another one that will deal with renewable energy options, both conventional and renewable energy options. And it's not going to be a technical legal paper. And it's just a matter of encouraging you, enforcing for you that you actually get engaged in looking at these different fuels and the options related to them. And then the optional paper will have to do with, remember I mentioned that large utility plan that you could look at that will be in the library. The optional paper would involve looking at that plan and critiquing it a little bit and then writing about what you've seen. And I'm going to ask you to talk about that in class anyway. Part of the reason I'm making that optional instead of mandatory is just a matter of timing. It turns out that the 3rd paper is due 2 weeks before what would have been the 4th paper, and the week in between is spring break. So I just didn't want to make you do a paper over spring break. So, but if you do the paper, it'll reduce the value of the final for you a little bit. So you have that option if you want to do that paper. And then if you don't change that, what happens? The final will be worth 30%. It'll be an open book, take-home final. And we'll decide together just how much time you'll have to work on that. But we'll give you that to work on as well. So that's it. I want to stop here. We'll give you a break in a minute. But I want to know if anybody has any questions, either about the scope of the course or what I just went through in terms of what the requirements are going to be. Monica. Is the course technical? No. The question is, if you've never done anything with energy, are you at a disadvantage? Have you ever gone on a factory tour? You ever gone to see how candy bars are made or anything like that? Maybe not. I just remember doing that when I was a kid. It was a lot of fun, and I didn't really, know anything about the machinery and how it worked, but I got to get exposed a little bit to the technical aspects of it, and that's what we're talking about here. It's more of an exposure than anything else. I'm not going to test you on your technical understanding of the way a combustion turbine functions. It's not going to be that kind of thing at all. Yeah. No, not critiquing a power plant. We'll talk about something called integrated resource planning, where the utility is required to look at its demand, the amount of power it's going to need to produce over a certain period of time, and then decide the best way to meet that demand. And so a combination of power plants and encouraging people to conserve. And I'm going to have you look at that. But what you're going to do is you're not going to be making a technical assessment. You're going to be playing what I refer to as logic police. You're going to look and see whether they found a good strategy for developing this plan, and then whether they did something that was consistent with that. But again, that's the optional paper, so let's not dwell on that too much. No, it's not. This is not going to be a class where you have to develop a technical expertise. You're going to get a technical exposure, though. And in the next hour, you'll get some of that. But it's designed to give you a context more than anything else. Does that help? Good. Nice question. Any other questions right now? Yeah, Michelle.
Some of the other electives that you've got mixed first years and people with expertise and actual practical experience. Do you handle grading curves differently for people at different levels, or is it all just the same?
Well, yeah. They kind of forced my hand on that a little bit. I have to grade 1 L's in one curve, and then 2 3 L's in another curve. And the LLMs don't have to be in anybody's curve, so they get a good deal. And then they give me a precise formula, and they say this is how many HHs you can give out, and this is how many H's, and then what I do is I look at everybody's performance in the class, and then if I can't stay within the formula they gave me, then I plead my case to the dean of students, and we see what we can do. So I don't know if that's helping you, if that's answering your question for you, but. That people have expressed this concern before, that, oh my goodness, somebody else came in with a prior knowledge about the area, and I have to compete against them for a grade. It doesn't tend to work that way. First of all, remember, most people have seen a toe of an elephant. They haven't seen the whole elephant. So for the rest of, maybe for one little day, for one bright and shining moment, they're going to know more than you do, but in most states they're not. So that's not going to really be a factor. Even I think people in Berk would even tell you they got some things they need to learn, right? So it's not. I don't think it's going to be like that. But this is really one of those classes where the way you apply yourself is much more important than the expertise you bring in. Much more important. It'll work, I promise. Good. Other questions? All right. Why don't we take 10 minutes and then come back and surge our way through here. Okay. If anybody wants to pick up an assignment sheet so they can see what that looks like, you're welcome to do that. Pardon? Yeah. Syllabus here. And the syllabus is right except for the first link. The first URL is not right. So, is that? Oh, yeah. Thanks. I should have asked. Thank you very much. Yeah, on a syllabus or, want an assignment sheet? These, I see. I handed somebody half the first original, so.
It was Andrew.
Okay, yeah, you can give him a whole, just give him a whole. Why don't I give you the rest of the original for him, and there's a two-sided one for you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. So, assignment sheet.
And that's the you send out the.
Yeah, that's the syllabus, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sure.
I have to travel next week.
Uh-huh.
I'm not going to be able to attend to class. I just film this or send
it doesn't hurt to send me an email. Probably a good thing to do that. But it's helpful. Telling me in advance is a great thing. So you going somewhere interesting?
To the Jumper in New York from the elements.
Yeah. Yeah. So you all going to go?
I think not all of them.
Oh, good. Well, I want to hear how it goes.
Thank you.
So, would you mind signing this?
So, this away, so
I was thinking, I'm still research about that. Set up a meeting or something like that.
Sure. Yeah. You send me an email, we'll set something up.
Okay, great.
All right. It's pretty general.
I'm still trying to narrow it down.
Yeah, how many pages do you have to write for this?
They don't give us a US, but they say it's usually around 40 or
Vicky Ortiz, the dean of students, have just sent around a note about, I think she said 40 pages.
40 pages, yeah, that's what I was going to shoot for, something around that. What I was sort of thinking is if I can, I'll try to get a draft done before spring break or something like that, so just to keep myself on track. But
yeah, and so what you're going to need from me, first more than anything else, is just to review your draft.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
And flash around ideas.
That'd be perfect. Yeah. And I found it pretty interesting. I found one West Virginia Supreme Court case that basically said that these wind farms can be a per se nuisance, and then I think some other states sort of go a different way on it. So I think at least based on that, I think there could be enough ground to explore. And I could also just get into the background of nuisance suits and sort of apply the traditional logic of that to wind farms and that sort of thing. So I think there is room for a topic there. I'm hoping so. But I'm gonna try to get some more material so I have something more concrete to tell you. But I'm excited. I think it should be interesting.
Well, good. Part of what will be interesting is that we're doing parallel research. I'm getting ready for this course that I will teach here next fall, but premiere this summer back in Vermont. So I'm going to have to get on the progress. So we'll probably find out some things that help each other. So. All right, so
I guess the only thing I didn't know what to do is whether, because I guess you typically credit their past, but you can also do it for a grade, so I wasn't sure how I should do that, or I don't know what people typically do.
Well, I've only done this here once before, and that time it was done for the past. So it was, probably the simplest thing to do.
Okay, that's fine with me.
It's really up to you if you really feel like you need this grade.
I think we can do a credit no pass. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So should I check that?
Yeah, I can do that. Okay. I guess already.
So where do I?
So I guess just 2 credits, which I guess sounded typical for what people do for that. So I guess just the signature.
Okay. So, have you talked to anybody in the administration about that?
I'm going to talk to Dean Ortiz.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think there's any problem, but it's much better to have her confirm. Well, it's fine to have her do it.
Okay.
I'll do that soon. So now you'll have to scamper. Okay. I've got other ideas.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm going to register tomorrow. So.
Okay.
Great. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. It'll be fun.
Yep.
Just see how you do. Oh, good. Thank you. I didn't have it pretty much. I figured. I haven't looked at it yet.
Because I know one of my professors, Rich Calendar, click on it. It's got the links to all of the sites that you can see, and PDFs, whatever, do it by day and send you out that way.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if it makes a difference, but...
No, what I've done is, if you go into resources, it says class 1, class 2, class 3, but actually it's more elegant.
I don't know. I mean, it seems to work.
Yeah. Good, thank you very much.
I could sign early and walk in. Oh, yeah. Why
public policy.
Okay, that sounds perfect.
Awesome.
Oh, this. Oh, you did? That's it. There, GoPro. Yeah, sure. Do you remember Esther?
Yes, that series where these classes. Screwing up the lower leg on this side, the upper leg on this side. So, yeah, because it's causing like really like it's blaming underneath my kneecap. So he wants to work on like you give me like this side, this side. It takes about half an hour, 3 times a day, and I'm like half an hour, 3 another hour. Can you do it sitting? Kind of stuff like under the table. Seriously, like don't mind me. I'll just no. It's mostly like rolling on the ground, and I don't think it would work so well. That'll be a big hit out of the recording. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh no.
I've got like half an hour of stuff.
Yeah.
Stretches, practice. Hey, thanks for assigning me such an eminently readable book.
Yeah, I just read the first chapter. Yeah, that's good. I know. I think the danger of having that book for me is that it's actually more interesting than some of my casebook reading for other classes. So I'm thinking, like, this is what I recommended, but I'd really rather read this than course reading for tomorrow. So it might actually be the cause of,
The biggest criticism I had in people's evaluations about that book is that we didn't talk about it in class.
Oh, yeah?
Read it and get into it. So people start reading it, they have to have we have an extra.
It was like a coffee hour.
I can tell you the court's nutshell. $10, and then you realize
But he like picks up every little thing.
Oh, yeah.
Sharp. I hope I'm that sharp. Oh, no. You get there. How was your our course? Yeah.
I guess one of those things where he sort of keeps doing it, he's always there.
Yeah. Someone was saying. But it's really like he talks like but like comments that he made, like whatever it is he's talking about, like the questions that you ask, he keeps accusing us of like trying to turn his hard questions into easy questions. We're like, oh, he's kind of changed all of those already. So we'll see how that goes.
We starting up? Do we have another minute? Or
Yeah, you want to take a minute?
kind of fill the water bottle?
Yeah, get that water bill.
We're gonna have on this class. Do you want to like know this in advance?
Yeah.
I know for a fact that this is January.
Yes,
Okay. Thank you. Try to set the
It's for you. Good reason.
That's right.
There's somebody like meet like next week or have something yeah, either. Yeah. Yeah, I think. Oh no, they just added our age. I have to do 3 classes. It's just that, yeah. Except for Wednesday.
My energy is there. Yeah. I used to play in rock band. Same kind of thing. I never wanted to take a break.
Yeah.
I didn't realize
Ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, we've got actually like 4 Berkeley almost all on this class, so I'm really excited.
Well, I'm excited about it too.
Yeah, Tyler are the 1Ls besides myself that are really getting into it. So. Yeah. I'm going to be
Someone's going to get well, all right, so when am so Monday's actually a holiday.
Right.
You guys have it off?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think Monday's going to be the best one. I could do Tuesday.
Yeah.
All right. How about you send me an email?
Yeah, absolutely.
What time is it?
Well, I finished class at like 2, so Tuesdays are pretty long.
I won't get back to those days.
Yeah. Whatever. Yeah. I'll send you an email first. Great, thanks.
Okay, enough fraternizing. Okay, one other sort of generic thing I want to mention, and then let's get a little substantive for the rest of the day, and that's the notion of, well, I guess at the term bar it's called office hours, but I really don't have much of an office at this point, so I guess we'll call it hours. But anyway, let me suggest to you as firmly as I can, you should come and talk to me. Don't think, well, if something comes up in the semester and I have a question, maybe I'll come by and see him. Come talk to me. I hope at this point in your careers you've started to recognize the value of making those direct contacts with the people who teach your classes. It may be handy in the future, you never know, but also I think I find it very helpful. It gives me, a better context for understanding where things you're saying may have come from. I mean, for instance, you'll see I've tried to do a couple of contextual things today already. I had you introduce yourselves, and I also asked you to fill out that sheet. In fact, I forgot to ask you all to hand it in. Some people have brought it up. If you haven't given it to me yet, if you can give it to me when you leave today, that'd be great. Or if you want to pass it forward now, that's fine too. But anyway, it's very helpful for me to have some face time with you, and it helps me understand a little bit more about how to gauge the class as well. You don't have to think of some clever reason to come see me. Just say you want to come see me. And the way to do that is to either mention it to me before or after a class, and we can try to set up a time, or send me an email. On the syllabus, you've got my email address and my phone number. It's my cell number, so it's me. It's not anybody else. And you're welcome to use either anytime you want. And people tend to do a lot of communicating here by email. So just let me know when you want to get together. We can do something before class, or maybe after class. And if neither of those work out, we can find another time. Okay. Any questions pop up in your minds during the break about how the class is going to work? All right. Well, hopefully the bulk of the remaining hour and 10 minutes we'll spend talking about the way the electric system works. But I wanted to give you a couple more mood images before we get to that point. In fact, if I had the proper music, it would help. But I want us to be thinking about some of these things. Most pictures are really not very fair, but so what? We use them anyway. Because I want you to think about this. This is mountaintop mining. For what? What are they mining on these mountaintops? Coal. And how do they do it? They basically go in and carefully scrape off every living thing. And then after they do that, they carefully place incendiary devices all over the place, and they blow up the top of the mountain. Then they take the pieces that haven't fallen down the mountain already, and they cart them down the mountain. They put them in the valley below, and usually it's on top of some, because this is a watershed area, so you got some kind of stream that you've now buried under all this riprap. And then fortunately, the good news is, after they've then gone in and scooped out all the coal that they find, over many years, they have to go back in and put the pieces together again. And so they're going to rebuild the mountain, and then they're going to plant some grass and some trees, and it's all going to be fine, as if nothing ever happened. Of course, one of the problems is when you blast those rockets apart, they never go back together quite the same way. So you don't actually take all that material and put it back up in the mountaintop, and a lot of it stays down there in the valley, and it winds up continuing to bury the streams and to ruin the habitat along the stream. You get the picture. Why am I bringing this up? Because we're going to talk a lot during the course about things like, we're going to get our greenhouse gas blinders on. Everybody's going to be thinking about just finding some ways to get carbon out of the atmosphere. And one of the big ones people talk about is carbon sequestration. We'll talk more about that later. What is carbon sequestration? It's saying that instead of taking the coal and having all that carbon go up the smokestack and into outer space, or unfortunately inner space, what we're going to do instead is we're going to process the coal first, make it into a gas, and when we make it into a gas, we can actually draw all the CO2 off, and we won't have to have it go up the smokestack. But then we got to do something with it, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to bury it under the earth, and we're going to find some former natural gas well or some other natural formation, and inject this stuff into a seam under the surface of the earth, and we'll keep it there for a few 100,000 years and won't bother us anymore. And so then the focus of the debate becomes, well, is sequestration something we can do? Is the technology available for gasifying the coal? And we start worrying all about this smokestack effect, and we stop thinking about the mountaintops. And we stop thinking about the black lung disease that miners still get. And we talk about we lose track of the fact that even to this day in the United States, people die in mine collapses. It's unfortunately happened just several months ago. And in other countries happens more often. So with each of these technologies, there are trade-offs. And I want to make sure we don't lose track of that. People talk about natural gas as being something that burns a lot cleaner than coal. Another phrase you're going to hear probably several times during this course is the notion of natural gas as a bridge fuel, bridging us from our intoxication with fossil fuels to an era where everything will be sweet and looking great because we're going to be just using renewables. But right now, we're not ready to do that. We don't have renewables cheap enough. We don't have all the technology in place we want now. So we need something to get us from today to tomorrow. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to burn natural gas. But don't worry, because natural gas emits half the carbon that coal does. So it's really a much better fuel. And if you look at those 300 terrible power plants, you're not going to find natural gas-fired power plants in that group. So so people start focusing on this and saying, well, this looks good. Let's get natural gas. Well, this is what getting natural gas means. This is the Green River Valley in Wyoming, as all of those of you who can read know. And this is a place where there are a bunch of gas fields. And how do they do this? Well, they go in again. And you don't have a mountaintop, but you scrape the surface clean of any habitat. You put a big pad down, and then you build a bunch of access roads, and you bury a bunch of pipelines, and you take what was a pristine valley with lots of different kinds of habitat in it, you turn it into a checkerboard, and it isn't what it used to be anymore, and it's never going to be what it used to be anymore. That's one of the things that happens with natural gas. Another thing is this whole notion of trying to go offshore to get gas some other place. We're going to talk about that a fair amount too. What you do is, let's say you want to get natural gas from Indonesia, instead of getting it from the Green River Valley in Wyoming. Well, how do you do that? Well, the problem is we don't have a pipeline from Indonesia. So you got to bring it over in tankers. And when we learn more about natural gas, we'll learn that natural gas is quite voluminous in its natural state. In fact, when you get your bill at the end of the month, if you ever look at it, it measures natural gas in therms. And let me just tell you, I'll cut to the chase. 1 therm of gas in normal atmospheric pressure takes up 100 cubic feet. 1 therm of gas. And what you can do with that therm is you can probably heat your house for a few hours in the evening. Okay? So if you transport gas in that state, it's not going to work really well. So what you have to do is you have to super cool it down until it becomes a liquid. And then you put it in a big tanker. And then you bring the tanker across the ocean. And when you get to the other end of the ocean, you have an offloading facility where you regasify it and you put it into the system. Well, so you're going to hear a lot of people say, natural gas, bridge fuel, get us to the future. And the way they're going to do that is by starting to import natural gas. Two big problems. One is we're trying to reduce foreign dependency, not increase it, but now we're going to start getting not only oil from other countries, but we're going to get natural gas from other countries. That's a problem, potentially. Problem number two is it takes a lot of energy to cool the gas. It takes a lot of energy to transport it. It takes a lot of energy to gasify it again at the other end. And so what you wind up doing is, remember how coal is supposed to have twice the carbon emissions that natural gas does? Well, not anymore. If you bring it over from another country, it starts looking a whole lot like the coal, right? I'm bringing these examples up because I want you to have your critical hat on at every moment. Not only in terms of what you're going to read, because a lot of things, let me tell you now, I don't necessarily agree with everything I'm asking you to read. I'm just asking you to read it. And so there are things that I'm hoping you're going to give real critical attention to in the readings, and you sure as heck better give critical attention to what I say, because I don't necessarily get it right either. And so this is the kind of big concept thinking I'm going to have to ask you to do during the course of this class. And then just, I won't dwell on this too much, but someone else produced this map that tries to identify where the highest emitting power plants are in terms of CO2 emissions. And you can see that in North America they cluster in what I think I'd refer to as the coal states, in parts of Illinois and then down in Pennsylvania and in Kentucky and in various places in the Midwest. But then look at China over at the far right, and you can see the challenge that's being created there in terms of carbon emissions.
You know what the color denotes?
The redder, the worse. I think the darker the color, the more carbon emissions. Sorry? Yes? I'm sorry?
Like a historical viewpoint of what were the coal power plants in the U.S. 700 years ago? Or?
Yeah, and I haven't seen anything like that, but I bet it's out there.
I think you should compare
Yeah.
China today what the U.S. was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good question. Let me know if you find anything. A few other fundamentals I think it's worth addressing. We'll have a day where we talk about oil, but I want to make sure there's some concepts in your mind now, even as we're starting the process. This is really a simple message being communicated here. The very top, the place where the red turns into white, that line up there shows the total demand for oil in the United States. The total consumption of oil in the United States. The blue section tells you how much is produced in the United States. So you can see that over the course of time, we've gotten to the point where production in the United States is leveled off. In fact, it's maybe slightly down in terms of what's being predicted for the next 10 or 15 years. But regardless, it's certainly falling far short of the consumption level. So it gives you a taste for, number one, for how much we're dependent on imports. But number two, look at it over the course of time, because if you look for 2007, which you have to imply is somewhere between 2005 and 10, you can see that there's still a lot of growth that's being projected for oil consumption going out beyond this year. So it's not like we sort of topped off on our overall demand. Yes?
Is the large dip after 1980, is that fuel standards? Is it increasing fuel standards for cars and so consumption?
Very good. Yeah. Good. Yes?
I'm curious about capacity. We have a lot of oil in the United States that can't get at environmental concern.
Right. Well, again, we'll talk about this on Oil Day. We talked about oil sands, tar sands, but there's also oil shale rather, and tar sands are in Alberta. The biggest oil shale deposits in the world, as it's understood, are in the United States, and everybody keeps talking about comparing various energy sources to OPEC or to Saudi Arabia. Apparently we've got an OPEC's worth of oil shale. And the question is, how much energy are you willing to consume to get energy out of the ground? And so, so when you ask this question of, how much can you get out of what we have in the United States, it depends on what you're willing to exert in order to get it. And so I think, from whatever I understand right now, the argument would be that for the foreseeable future, we could meet our demand with things you could find domestically. If you're willing to drill everywhere offshore, if you're willing to go up into ANWR in Alaska, and if you're willing to get an energy return that's very low. In other words, if you're willing to put 80 units of energy in and get 100 units of energy out in the form of oil from shale, you can do it. And so, it depends what you're willing to do to accomplish it and how much you're willing to spend. Partial answer, anyway. Any other questions right now? Okay, well, again, I wanted to put this notion of foreign oil demand into context. Here are the major oil exporters, snapshot in time, 2005. And first of all, remember what I was saying about Russia and the other former Soviet Union countries. You can see there's the orange section down the bottom right. About a quarter of the exports come from that area. Saudi Arabia is huge. And you can see, focus for a minute on Canada, that little blue wedge up there on the left side. And Mexico also is relatively small. Further on the left, it's a gray section. Why am I pointing those things out? Because this is what current U.S. oil imports look like. This may or may not surprise some people. But we actually get more oil from Canada and Mexico than we do from Saudi Arabia. Well, that's a relief. I thought we were all concerned about our dependence on the Middle East, and lo and behold, it turns out that we're largely getting oil from our friends. Well, that's now, but this is what people are saying about the future. And these kind of drafts, if anybody suffer from migraines, I'm going to ask you this question again at the end of the class because it may be, unfortunately, a different thing. But so this is trying to show all the exports over the course of time, and obviously there's some projection in there because it goes beyond this year. But I'd invite you to hunt around and try to find Canada and Mexico, and I think what you'd find is that Mexico's below that top green section there. It's white. And you can see that what happens to it, the projection is you get beyond 2015, and it squeezes down almost to nothing. Okay, and then if you're looking for Canada, Canada is sort of it's just very pale green, and it's up near the top. Take my word for it, it starts out really low and gets lower. Okay, so the fact of the matter is that the supplies from the exports from these countries are tapering off dramatically. Why? Anybody have a guess as to why that's happening? Part of it. Yeah, any other guesses? Pardon? They need it. They're needing more of it. Mexico's doing a little better, got more production down there. Canada's using a lot of their energy to get that tar out of the sands, but that's another issue. Tim?
I was just going to ask, the U.S. is still the third largest producer in the world, though, right, as far as...
It's up there. I don't know exactly what its percentage is right now, but yeah, it's still a very significant producer, but it's certainly not a significant exporter. There is a little that gets exported, but not much. Josh?
The U.S. imports only a relatively small or smaller percentage of all these oil exports.
That's right.
So it's kind of hard to tell the fact that, for example, Mexico gets very, very small in that graph, what effect any of that will have on U.S. imports.
That's right. That's right.
I guess my question is, will it? I mean,
yeah.
Do we know for sure that the amount that Mexico is exporting is shrinking actually will affect us, or will it not?
Well, I think the understanding is that that it will affect what's coming to the United States, because they're really basically not sending much anywhere, and they're not going to send much here either. Obviously, it's easier to get oil to the United States than it is to get it to Europe or Asia, so that's going to have an effect. But they're going to need what they can produce. Actually, I'm not going to go over this migraine headache right now. It's a good one, but later. The other thing I want to give you a taste of is how we produce electricity in the United States. the primary message I want to offer here, you can hear over and over again. Baby blue. It's about 56.5% coal. All right? That's not the way it is in California, but is the way it is on average nationally. Now let's reflect on that for a second, because if it's not the way it is in California is, what, 66%, 1/6 of the national economy or something like that, or a tenth of the national economy, you can imagine that there's some states that are much more than 50% dependent on coal. And we're going to talk about that in more detail later. But you'll see that nuclear power is hanging in there around a quarter of the electric generation. Natural gas in this particular snapshot in time, which is 2001, was at 7.7%. Let me assure you, the overall use of natural gas for power plants has been growing geometrically since then. We'll talk about that again later as well. Over the course of time, it's going to mean that natural gas is going to have a larger part of that wedge of that pie than the 7.7%. But in all current projections, coal stays up there at or above 50% into the foreseeable future in terms of fuel source. I mentioned the fact that we're increasingly going to be relying on imports for natural gas as well as for oil. And this is one projection provided by the Energy Information Agency that I mentioned earlier. Remember that department, part of the Department of Energy in Washington that produces energy reports. This is what they were projecting as of at least 3 years ago in terms of the nature of the imports we're going to have. Now, what does this mean? Well, currently we're very dependent on natural gas from Canada, especially in California and also in the East Coast and some parts of the East Coast. But California, there's a big fat pipeline that comes down from Alberta and makes its way down into California, and a very large percentage of the gas used here comes from that source. And they're, again, holding on to much more of that gas to use in Canada for private use, but also for their tar sands projects. So they have less that they can provide to us, so the projection is that the role of Canadian gas is going to reduce. Mexican gas is going to stay real low, and we're going to be relying much more on gas that's brought in liquefied form, liquefied natural gas, in those tankers that I was talking about. Again, this is just sort of a taste of these things. We'll get into them more later. But if we're going to be importing more natural gas, where's it going to come from? And again, this is a taste of where the potential is for gas to be exported. And as you can see, while we're talking about reducing our dependency on the Middle East for oil, we're thinking about the potential of increasing our dependency on the Middle East for natural gas. And I can say that safely, even if we don't wind up buying any natural gas from the Middle East, because an interesting thing happens when you're dealing with gas. If you're oh God, I can't do my maps yet. I haven't really practiced it. All right, so let's pretend that this is a country that looks like the United States, and then anybody convinced? Okay, all right. You forgot about Baja. All right. So this is the United States, and they have gas reserves in various places dotted around the country, and then it travels to various places through fixed pipelines. All right. So if California, which is clearly demarcated over here, were to reduce its dependence on gas from this source here, then maybe someone over there is going to buy it. But it's sort of held captive to these pipelines and where the pipelines go. Well, guess what? None of the pipelines go offshore, so California might compete with other states for gas supplies, but that's it. Well, as soon as you go offshore, you're relying on a tanker, and the tanker is not fixed. In fact, by definition, it's got to float. So it's going to move around. And they could change their mind about where they're going to end up anytime they want to. So, yeah, there can be contracts, but bear with me. So the point is that California, when it starts dealing with offshore gas, is competing with the world, with any place in the world where there's a large demand for natural gas and not a good domestic supply. Anybody can tell me the name of one country where that really applies? A lot of natural gas demanded and very little supply?
Japan.
Ah, good idea. Yes, Japan. Good, right? Fair enough? Okay, yeah. Yeah, there's very little natural gas there. So Japan already relies significantly on LNG, liquefied natural gas. All right, so what's going to happen is this world demand, this world competition for these supplies is going to affect price. And so what happens with Middle East gas, even if the Middle East gas doesn't come directly to the United States, is going to affect price, and it's going to affect what happens in the U.S. Again, something else to think about later. We're going to dwell a lot in this class on California, and it's for several reasons. One is that we happen to be located there. Another one happens to be that I happen to work there and know a lot about it, or more about it than I know about other states. But it's a pretty handy result to occur because the fact of the matter is that California is pushing the envelope in a large number of policy areas related to energy in general and electricity in particular. So what happens in California in this instance is going to have a big impact on what happens elsewhere in the country and in the world. So it's probably good to think a little bit about the context in California as we look at those things. Remember I mentioned that coal isn't over 50% in California. It's down below 25% at the time that this particular snapshot was taken. And you can see that there was a large, and I will tell you, growing dependence on natural gas. Natural gas, remember in the first pie chart, and you got all these things memorized already, right? First pie chart showed 7.7% nationwide of the electricity was generated with natural gas, 7.7%. Okay? Now we're in California, and it's 38%, okay, and growing. All right? There are a couple of nuclear power plants. They're 15%, but it's not going to change for the foreseeable future. There aren't even any new plants that are on the drawing boards in California. Coal is interesting because there actually aren't any coal plants in California. Oh, there's a small plant they'll talk about at some point, but this coal is coming from Nevada and not Wyoming, Nevada and Utah. And it's interesting, one of the larger coal plants, which I'll talk about later in the course, I went and visited. The plant I'm describing right now happens not to be operating currently, but it's such a colorful example. I like to provide it. And I went up to that plant. I could stand on one of the levels of the plant, look out like this, just straight ahead of me, and see 3 different states. Because we could see it was in Nevada, it was in Laughlin, Nevada, and then California was right across the river, and then Arizona was right below it. Well, obviously, they situated this plant as close as they could to California and other states because they really wanted to sell power into California. California has not wanted to have coal-fired plants, so they've been built right up on the edge of the border. The other thing I guess I want to point out here is that at the point, again, this is probably closer to the year 2000 than to right now, but it shows that about 10% of the power came from renewable energy sources. But let me qualify that a little bit because we got this other renewable energy source over there called large hydro. Those are the dams that are on all the rivers in Northern California, and they're a significant source of electricity in the state because those dams have hydroelectric turbines, and we'll talk about those on the right day. But we don't tend, when we talk about renewables, we don't tend to include the large hydro. The reason we don't do that is that well, the damage has been done. The valleys have been flooded. The dams have been constructed. The habitat's gone. We'll use that. Thank you very much. But when we talk about renewables, we're trying to talk about things we can do forward-going that are not going to have that kind of footprint on the planet. And so to look at those things, we're looking at things like biomass, which largely means burning wood products and sometimes trash. Geothermal, California has very significant geothermal resources. We'll talk about those. The solar and the wind components are growing. Small hydro is when you take a stream and you don't divert the water from the stream. You put something in the flow of the stream, maybe a paddle that gets pushed by the current, and you generate electricity that way. And there's a fair amount of electricity that is generated that way in this state. Again, a little bit more of a snapshot.
Conspicuous by its absence is oil. Why is that?
Because oil is not, well, it's interesting. If you took the snapshot in 1976, let's say, then you would have seen almost no natural gas and a lot of oil. Most of the earlier fossil fuel plants in the state were built to be bi-fuel plants. They could run with natural gas or oil. And so whichever one happened to be more plentiful and cheaper is the one that would be used. And so what happened, though, is that in the late 70s, and the other thing I should mention is that for a long period of time, the price of gas and oil tended to track each other. I mean, you didn't measure them the same way. You had you had a barrel of fuel oil and you had therms of natural gas. But if you did an energy equivalent per dollar, you look at how much you had to spend to get the energy you needed they tracked each other. They were fairly equivalent. Why did that happen? For two reasons. One was because these plants were biofuels, so they knew that, if the gas people knew if they made their gas too expensive, they couldn't sell to anybody because everybody would buy oil. And but the second reason is a lot of the natural gas is produced at oil wells. It's a byproduct of collecting oil. In fact, any of you remember ever seeing a gas refinery when they have smokestacks and at the top of the smokestack is a flame? You know what that flame is? They're taking natural gas out of the oil and they didn't even want to bother with it, so they send it up the smokestack and they burn it. So that's what we used to do with a lot of natural gas. But the point is that we're getting them largely from the same sources. So the prices tracked each other. And Christopher, then I'll finish what I'm saying. What were we going to say, Christopher?
I was just wondering if oil is produced in California that much in the
Yeah, there's a lot of oil produced in California. Yeah, Josh is going to tell us when he gives us their full report on what's going on with oil. But I can't remember exactly what the breakdown is. But there's actually a significant amount of oil produced here, and gas is produced in California too. It's just not the kind of gas. It's not largely the kind of gas the utilities want. But again, we'll talk about that further. But I guess what I wanted to add is that starting in the late 70s, gas and oil prices started diverging a little bit, and gas became cheaper, partially because it became plentiful, and we'll talk about why that happened. So almost all the power plants in the state that ran on oil at the time converted to natural gas. They stuck with natural gas so long that over the course of time they shed the facilities that allowed them to do biofuel, and then the new plants that were built as natural gas plants because gas is more efficient, because gas is less polluting, and it was very plentiful. So there was a movement away from oil, not only in California but everywhere, almost everywhere. We'll look at that again, and I'll show you how much of the fuel actually comes from oil. But I'm not going to go through these because I know what you really came here for today, and that's to hear from me about how electricity works. And I want to go through that. It's worth doing once, and I think it's kind of fun in a way. So any other questions about the overview I just gave on fuels? We'll have plenty of time to talk about these things again. So first of all, this is sort of a sketch of the grid, and actually I don't want you to stare at it right now because I want to ask you another question, which is, who can tell me what electricity is? Anybody get a chance to do any reading about that? Yeah, Christopher.
Movement of electrons.
Movement of electrons. And how are those electrons moving?
They're generated by the rotation of a magnet, and
yeah. Well, okay. But what's happening? Are they where are the electrons that we're talking about? Are they just floating in space, or are they in a wire? They're in a wire, aren't they?
Right.
Okay, so
they're electrons of assumed metals that the wires.
Yeah, and so what's happening to the electrons? I mean, literally, what's happening to them?
Like energy is added to the particle, and then the electrons transfer between atoms of copper or whatever the wire is made of.
Okay. And how fast are those electrons moving? You have any guess? What's your guess about how fast they're moving?
Somewhere near the speed of light.
The electrons? See, it was a trick question, and I tricked you. The electrons actually are moving very, very slowly, like a third of a foot a second or something like that. But what we call electricity moves it near the speed of light. So what's happening? Well, first of all, Christopher alluded to this a little bit. How do we generate electricity? You take a magnet and you take a wire and you move one past the other. And what happens is that the magnet causes the electrons to get all excited, and they've got to do something, right? They got all this energy now. They got to figure out what to do. So they start moving instead of in a random motion. They start moving in a concerted way in one direction as opposed to another. And in order to finish that image, and then actually, oops, I don't want to get there yet. Unfortunately, if I'd had, there was so much going on for class, I didn't get a chance to get us on the web, so this isn't going to work the way I wanted it to. But have you ever seen one of these things? Right? Newton's cradle. And you ever played with one of them? And it's, for in the 60s and 70s, they called these executive toys, which was kind of, all right, I know I blew it. Get out of here. Executive toys. So what would you do? You'd go, the simplest thing you do is you go to one end of it, and you take, those balls are on strings, and they're hanging from the top. And so you just, if you want to play with it, you take the ball on the end, and you pull it out a little bit, and you let go. Then what happens? It bangs into the other balls, and then what happens? Anybody? The one at the other end goes popping out. But the ones in the middle stay absolutely still. They don't go anywhere. And if you could really get advanced, you could take two of them out at the one end, pull them out, let them go, and two will bounce out at the other end, and the one in the middle stays still. And so the reason I want to show you this, because this is exactly what's not happening with electricity. This is not happening at all. But it's an interesting image, and I want to consider for a moment that these balls are electrons, and then think about the fact that something is moving through those electrons, but it's not the electrons that are actually doing much of the moving. That's the image I want you to get out of this. Now with Newton's cradle, what are they demonstrating? They're demonstrating was it conservation of momentum? Is that what it, more physics than I can possibly handle today. But that's what's happening is that the momentum is getting transferred through the electrons, which are these balls, if you'll excuse my metaphor, and then it comes out the other end with a momentum being transferred to the ball on the end, and it bounces back and does the same thing, and it keeps going back and forth, and it can keep many executives amused for a long period of time. So what's happening though with electricity? Well, you've got this wire, you've got a copper wire, let's say, and there are a bunch of electrons in it, and in order to get this effect that we're talking about with the magnet creating current, the more wire you have, the more of an effect you're going to get. So you actually wouldn't just take one little loop of wire like this. You'd wind lots of wire around. And the more wire you wind, the more you're going to get out of the process. And so you start this a piston, or not a piston, a axle in the middle with these wound wires on it. You turn it in the vicinity of a magnet. And that magnet's going to create some excitement in the electrons. And what it's going to do is this movement of the electrons is going to create what's called an electromagnetic field. And that electromagnetic field is what's going to be moving near the speed of light. That's what's going to be flashing along the lines, basically riding along the outside of the line, not even going inside where the electrons are, as fast as it possibly can. If you had a chance to read the Steve Ferry article, what he pointed out there is that they say at the end of a movie, no animals were harmed in the production of this film. No electrons were consumed in the production of this electricity. The electrons are still there, they're still in the wire, and they're there to do more service for you at a later date. Well, what was he getting at in the article? What he was trying to point out is that electricity is really not a commodity. It's not some physical thing that you can hand to somebody and then they can consume and they can say thank you very much. It's a service. You're actually pushing these fields out, letting people use those fields to do work, and then they give the fields back. It's a return policy, and so there's really nothing that gets consumed in here. So what we have is the perfect perpetual motion machine. Isn't this great? We just send the fields out, bring them back, and just keep moving it around, and we got energy forever, and we don't have to spend anything to do it. Oh, I'm sorry, there's one problem. We have to find some way to turn the axle. Okay? And remember, the more wire there is on the axle, the more energy you get out. Also, the faster you spin it, the more energy you get out. So what we want to do is get a big, long, huge axle with a lot of wire wound around it and some big, fat, huge magnets. Okay, and you put them in something that's usually referred to as a generator. And then you need something to get that axle spinning and get it spinning really fast. Okay, and the reason we don't have a perpetual motion machine is we need some kind of energy to push the thing around. For most kinds of electricity, that's it. That's all we're doing. We're just spinning the stupid thing past the magnets. And it's something someone figured out a long time ago, and we're still doing it. And what makes this course interesting is because of the fuel we need to run the process. Well, let me define things a little bit, because we're going to be using these terms a lot. A kilowatt hour is the unit of electricity we tend to talk about. And I try to find ways to conceptualize these things. So let me try to offer this. Humor me if you will. First of all, hopefully within a couple of years you won't see these things anymore. It's an old conventional light bulb. But an incandescent bulb, if it's a 100-watt bulb, and you had 10 of those 100-watt bulbs, at any one moment in time, it would take 1,000 watts to power them up. All right? Kilo means 1,000. So it takes 1,000 watts to keep those 10 lights shining at any particular moment in time. Now, the way we measure the service that's being provided by electricity is in terms of the amount of watts that are needed over the course of time. So a kilowatt hour means that if you had 10 bulbs, each one was a 100-watt bulb, and you let them burn for an hour, you would need 1 kilowatt hour of electricity to keep them going, keep them lit. Okay? Easy enough? So what's a megawatt? Because when we talk about power plants, we're going to talk about megawatts. Well, sorry, we didn't get there yet. A megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. All right. So remember, we started out with these 100-watt bulbs, and we needed 10 of them to get to 1,000, and that made 1 kilowatt. So then you needed to get to a megawatt. You need to have 1,000 of those kilowatts, because remember, a million is 1,000 times 1,000. All right. With me so far? So then what's a gigawatt? Well, a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts. So we're now 1,000 times 1,000 times 1,000. All right? So this is interesting. Remember the Energy Information Agency I referred to earlier just came out with their pronouncement for how much electricity was used in the United States of America in the year 2007. And the answer is 4 million gigawatt hours. Right? That doesn't sound very big, does it? Only 4 million. I got all these people and all this stuff going on. Well, I tried to make it impress you a little bit more by laying it out there, with zeros. And so you see, that's what 4 million gigawatt hours looks like in terms of kilowatt hours. You got all those. I'm going to count all those zeros for you. Are you impressed yet? Well, then the other thing I figured, well, it would take, if you had those 100-watt bulbs we were talking about, you can get 4.5 billion of those, and you burn them all day and all night, all year long. And if you did that, that would produce 4 million gigawatt hours. Well, for someone who finds numbers larger than about 15 to be hard to conceptualize, I didn't know what to do with that. So I tried to break it up and figure, well, all right, if each person in the United States had a certain number of light bulbs and burned them all day and all night, all year, how many would you need? And the answer was 13. So I showed that to my wife. She said, well, that's pretty small. So I was not impressing anybody, so I decided I had to go a little further. All right, so consider, if you will, AT&T Park. This is, for those of you who are new to the area, this is the ballpark that San Francisco Giants play in. It used to be called SBC Park, and before that it was called Pac Bell Park. But that's another regulated industry, and we're not going to get there today. But so I was curious as to how many light bulbs you need to get the night games going at the field. So I actually called over to Pac Bell Park and talked to the chief engineer. And he gave me all kinds of information. I was really impressed. So see those lights that ring the field? Let's forget all the other energy involved in operating the facility. Let's just think about the lights that ring the field. Well, coincidentally, and actually kind of conveniently, it turns out that it takes 1 million watts to light the field. 1 million watts, which we otherwise refer to as a megawatt. Right? Okay, so I got to find my statistics here because I'm going to blow this if I don't have it. All right, here we go. So there's something like 500 bulbs. Those big bulbs there, and each one of those bulbs it takes 2,000 watts. All right, so the question is, if you burned the lights in Pac Bell Park 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year long, how many Pac Bell Parks would you need to use up all the electricity used up in the United States? And the answer is you would need 460,000 ballparks like that, burning their lights 24 hours a day to use up all the electricity that was used in the United States. Let's consider California alone. And here's an anatomically correct map of California. And you would need 40,000 Pac Bell parks in California running all day and all night to use up as much electricity as we used in the United States. Is that more impressive? Thank you, because it took a lot of work. Now, all right, so let's look at reality. We don't have that many Pac Bell parks. How's the electricity being used in the United States? And as it turns out, it's relatively evenly divided among residential, commercial, and industrial facilities. And I want to try to give you a little bit of taste now that we've talked about kilowatt hours in terms of how much things tend to use. I mean, these are average figures, and it's going to differ depending on what size refrigerator you have, and heaven forbid if you have a plasma TV or whatever. But this will give you a sense. This is annual consumption. This is how many kilowatt hours you need over the course of an entire year. So a refrigerator is using about 100 kilowatt hours a month. A laptop computer is using about half of a kilowatt hour a month. No, I'm sorry, about 5 kilowatt hours a month. Did I get that? Yeah, 5 or 6. And TV is somewhere in between. And if you've got a waterbed, you get a pretty big bill going too. And then the last column shows you total consumption nationwide for each of those particular kind of things. Now, I'll try to revisit this concept later in the course when we talk about energy efficiency, because one good question is, if you want to try to reduce energy consumption, where should you start? One particular answer might be, well, let's start with refrigerators. They're big users. They're going all day and all night. They're the biggest individual consumers of domestic electricity in the country. So if we can make refrigerators more efficient, then we could probably save a lot right there. Well, that is where people started, and we'll talk about what the result was when we get later in the course. But right now, we're really just trying to get some bricks to put into the wall later. So let's talk about that electricity and how it's going to be generated. Remember, you want to have a turbine to spin a shaft to run past the magnet and create electricity. And there are a couple of conventions in terms of how those generators tend to work. And there are some basic models, and we're going to talk about them again as the course goes on, so I want to introduce them to you now. Probably the most basic kind would be a gas turbine. And what that means is that you take some fuel, you put it in some kind of vessel, and you burn it. And when you burn it, it forms a gas. And the gas gives off energy because when it's hot, it's expanding, and it's going to push the blade around. It's going to push the turbine around. Because remember, you're going to have something that looks like a propeller that's going to be in that turbine. It's going to take the force of the gas pushing against it, and it's going to spin it around. All right, so all you're doing with a gas turbine is just taking the fuel and directly burning it. Okay? So far, so good? Then there's a steam generator. What you do with a steam generator is you take the fuel, you put it in a boiler, and then you run something else by it, usually water, and then you let the heat of the fuel burning turn the water into steam, and then you use the steam to push the blade around. So here we were just taking the gas and burning it and using that to push the blade around. And then here we're using the fuel in the furnace to boil water. And then you use the water to create steam, and the steam pushes the blade around. And if you think about it, there's some kinds of energy sources that are going to work better than others with these two different approaches. For instance, it's probably easy to understand how you could take natural gas and use it in a gas turbine. You spray the gas in, you have a flame there, it lights it, it creates steam, and you're fine. But other things would be really sloppy, messy, or practically impossible to do this way. Coal, for instance. If you try to just kind of flash the coal into an oven and fire it up and use that to run a turbine, the turbine's going to get all gunky and messy and awful, and you have particles flying all over the place, and it just doesn't work. So with coal, it makes more sense to do this. You create the heat in the furnace with the coal, and then you use that heat to create steam and use the steam to push the turbine around. Okay? And that's what's done. The other good example of where you need a steam turbine is for nuclear power. You got radioactivity, so you don't want to take those radioactive particles and just put them in the furnace and blast them away and send them out in the atmosphere. You want to contain them. So you put them in a very well-protected container and you use them to generate heat, and you use that heat to generate steam. So it's the same basic concept gets employed with various kinds of fuels. All right, then later people realize, well, we can get a lot more efficient if we take these two processes and throw them together. Because when you take just a gas turbine and you run that gas through a turbine, there's going to be waste heat when you get it done. You're not going to use every bit of that heat to push the turbine. It's going to be a lot that's going to get sort of thrown out, right? And so combined cycle facility, you run it through that turbine, and then you trap the waste heat, and then you use that to boil steam, and then you use that steam to push another generator. So you're using the same energy to make electricity twice. A lot more efficient. When things are more efficient, they're less polluting because you're using less fuel to get more electricity. So people started liking these. They were economical and they were less polluting. And so there's been more of a movement toward combined cycle ways of generating electricity. All right. I guess there's one other thing I'd like to talk about. This is an interesting rule of thumb that applies in this field and in many others. And that's that it tends to be that the less expensive something is to build in terms of a power plant, the more expensive it's going to be to make electricity from that plant. I mean, think about this gas turbine. It's not very technically difficult, but there's going to be a lot of wasted heat, and the fuel's going to go away, and you're going to be a lot of inefficiency. But when you get up to the combined cycle facility, it's going to be a lot more efficient, right? It's going to be a lot more expensive to build, much more equipment and much more intricate process. I mean, it's a rule that seems to apply to life. I mean, think about, everybody have a printer on their computer? If you get an inkjet printer, you can almost get the companies to pay you to take them. But you get a laser jet, it's very expensive. Well, when you do the printing, there's a reason for that. When you do the printing, you're paying with your children's food supply. Basically, when you're doing inkjet printing and you get a laser, it's actually very inexpensive per print. And that same concept applies all the way through the process. So it gets very interesting later when you try to decide what kind of power plants you want to have and how you're going to use them. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. Any questions so far? Josh and then Christopher.
How efficient are we talking about?
How efficient are we talking about?
The total energy that is expelled when you burn natural gas, how much of that is actually transferred into the,
Great question. Next. Actually, and I don't remember what the numbers are.
About a third.
Third?
About a third, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So you're losing about 2/3 through the stack. And then when you have a combined cycle, you're not, because the energy going into it is there's less heat,
right,
much lower energy state.
Right.
You're not getting nearly as much out of the combined cycle. So
right.
Your overall energy efficiency is only increasing by like 10% by putting that extra boiler in.
Mm-hmm.
So over 20 years, it'll pay for itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good way of explaining it. That's why you need to use those plants a lot to make them economical. Yeah, and that's why you also don't want to use the gas turbine ones, many of the gas turbine plants, a whole lot, because it's going to be very uneconomical.
They're very compact, though, so that's why they're
that's right.
popular.
Yeah. Good. Somebody had an answer for your question. Christopher.
When did combined cycle start to come into relevancy?
1980s.
1980s. Yeah, they became very popular in the 1980s. I think that they were developed over the course of.
I mean, they could have been around before
yeah.
that. That's when the economics made them worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Which was really, again, a time when we moved away from oil, and now we're moving to natural gas. And so you're seeing a lot more of those facilities being built. Good questions. Any others? Okay. All right. This is a beautiful illustration of how the electric system works. Okay. First of all, I'm cheating by letting you even see that at the beginning. But all right. Let's say that we've got an electric generator and we want to deliver the power to people. What do we need to do? All right, we've got the generator. What else do we need? Anything else? We just have people come with a cup and collect it. And, yeah. Elaine? Pardon? Need some way to transmit it. Okay. Need some way to transmit. Anything else?
Something to receive it.
someone to receive it. This is good. Okay, and now what we're going to do is, with the way we've got ourselves structured, now we've got lots of power plants that tend to be fed into the same lines, right? And so then they have to go through a transformer, and actually they call this a step-up transformer. In other words, it's going to be more efficient to move the power through the lines if you can aggregate a lot of that electricity and move it through at higher voltage. So it's stepped up to a higher level, brought through the transmission lines. Then it has to go to step-down transformers because you don't want to take it into your house at that level. And so it goes through a step-down transformer and then goes through a bunch of lines that are referred to as distribution system. And they're often little substations along the way too, and then you eventually get to the customers at the end of the line. So we tend to think about this system as having three significant components to it. We think of generation, and then we think about transmission, and then we think about distribution. And so that's where this beautiful illustration comes in, Harry. You're going to make me not wait another minute on this illustration. Yes?
Do you also need the capacity to store it? Like, assuming that you want to be able to use it on demand?
That's a great question. It's actually the question of the century. Actually, storage is let me get to that in a second and talk about. I'll answer your question, but let me build up to it just a little bit. Yeah. Pardon?
I was just going to ask, how much energy is, what's a transformer really? It goes to the transformer to that, it steps it up, and then it steps it back down. Is the transformer powered by something, or is it just a certain thing that allows it to do? There's a website that I suggested you look at that actually describes a transformer and how it works. And by the way, I'm not expecting today that everybody's had a chance to read it before they got into class, so don't worry about that. But it's basically a system of wires in a big box, and it's the relationship of small sets of wires to big sets of wires that changes the voltage. And so it's not, Andrew, tell me if I'm wrong, but it's not a mechanical system. Right, it's a passive system.
It's Faraday's principle. It's the field. It's similar to the way the energy is generated, where there's a field created. And what it does is, because the power lost in the wires is proportional to the current, you want to increase the voltage for the same amount of power. So with the high tension wires that are set really far apart, those are really high voltage. Actually, there's a picture up there. Those are really high voltage, and that's how energy or electricity is set over long distances. And then you have the local transformer stations in neighborhoods and things like that.
Yeah.
To step it down to what's going in the low telephone pole wires.
Yes. Move from the power plants to the step-up transformer, then through the high power transmission lines, then down transformer, and then distribution, and then a light bulb pulsates at the end of the process. And now, Harry's question was really a golden question. Do you get to store this stuff somehow and you get to use it later? Remember when we talked about what's going on with these fields, and we decided that this is really, or at least I suggested to you, it's more like a service than a commodity. It's hard to store a service, isn't it? I mean, you want someone to come and clean your house. You can store a cleaned house, but you can't store the cleaning service very well, And if you want someone to entertain you, you can maybe store a copy of the performance, but you can't store the entertainment very well. And that's a big challenge here, because what we're dealing with, we're taking advantage of with electricity, is the dynamic process of those waves moving, right? So what happens is that you have a system that has to be perfectly coordinated. You have to know what the total demand is, and you have to provide the supply that, as precisely as possible, matches that demand. And for reasons that hopefully were clear if you had a chance to do some of the readings, there were two ways we could have decided to move power around at long distances. And one would be to do what's called direct current, and the other would be to have alternating current. Now, alternating current in some ways is the simplest thing to produce because the process of spinning those wires past the magnets creates a current that has a cycle to it. Because you have the North Pole and you got South Pole, you have different reactions happening as the wires are spinning around. And what the wise folks decided to do in the United States many decades ago was to rely on that alternating current that gets generated and move power through lines in the form of that alternating current. Well, what that means is that every power plant has a natural cycle to it. It's spinning at a certain ratio, where you've got, if you imagine a wheel, there's a spot on the wheel, and that spot is going to show up at the same point according to a certain cycle. And in order to have this system work, with all these transmission lines and transformers and everything else to have it work properly, all the generators have to be in the same cycle. Right? So they all have to be coordinated when they're generating. And then, as I said, there has to be a match between the amount of power that's being demanded and the amount of power that's being produced. Because the issue of storage is really the big Achilles heel. We don't have a good, effective way to store electricity. We have some ways to store the work provided by electricity and then convert that back into electricity later. We can do that in certain kinds of batteries. The other technology, which I've always fascinated by because it's so fundamental, you could imagine them doing it 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome. But basically, you can, if you have a mountain area and you've got a reservoir down here, you can use electricity to pump that water up to a reservoir at a higher level up here, and then you could keep the water there as long as you want, and then you could take advantage of that extra altitude to release the water back downhill, run it through a turbine, and generate electricity later. And that actually is done in a number of locations in California and other places. It's called pumped storage. I mean, that's phenomenally simple, and it's almost like you figure that's what they're doing in the Flintstones. But basically that's about the best we have. Other people have talked about creating giant flywheels. A huge, heavy wheel that would be horizontal to the ground, and use electricity, use that energy to make the wheel spin around. And because it's so big, it's going to have its own momentum going, and so it will keep spinning for a very long time. And then later, when you need the electricity, you could put some resistance against that wheel and then use that to generate current. And but so it's the problems we're having with storage that are affecting a lot of things. For instance, the whole notion of electric vehicles or hybrids or plug-in hybrids for automobiles. The batteries are the weak link. How do you get enough storage capability? How do you make the batteries last long enough? And those are all issues that are being dealt with. So it's a very fact that electricity is difficult to store that makes it different from a lot of other things. It makes it more like a service and makes it very different from other commodities. Natural gas, for instance. I can use natural gas to run my water heater at home, or I could use electricity. Natural gas can be stored. Gasoline can be stored. Electricity cannot, and so very effectively. So that has a huge impact on the way the whole business works, and also has major implications in terms of the whole notion of deregulating. And we'll be talking about that a lot more as time goes by. A quick tutorial on transmission lines. We don't have a lot of time. Remember, I mentioned that there are basically two ways to transmit electricity. One would be through alternating current lines, AC lines. And the line at the left is an example of one of those. A DC line would involve taking that alternating current, converting it to direct current. It's not oscillating. It's just moving directly. And then sending that long distances through lines. And then you have another transformer at the end that converts it back to alternating current because we run our appliances and all of our machinery on alternating current. Remember, so there was two different kinds of systems. In this country, the grid that we operate, the transmission lines are almost entirely made up of alternating current lines. There are some major DC lines. For instance, there's one that runs from Southern California up into Canada. It's used specifically to take power a very long distance. And in a minute, I'll talk about why it's left for that usage. To step the power down to a level where it can be used through the distribution system, we generally rely on substations. This is a picture of a substation. They're very beautiful. We tend to like having a lot of them around us. You won't notice many in urban areas. They're there, but they're disguised. They usually are put into buildings so that you can't tell they're there. I want to very quickly touch on the concept of transmission line reliability. If you've got a lot of generating sources and you've got one line, if somebody could find a way to cut that line, you've lost the ability to get power from any of those generating sources. That's a big issue. So how do you make sure that these transmission lines are as reliable as possible? Well, one concept is you try to keep them separate from each other. Because you've got one line standing by itself. By the way, conventionally, the alternating current lines that we use are bundled with 3 different conductors. That's why you got these 3 arms sticking out there. It's been found from the matter of physics, this is the most efficient way, apparently, to transmit electricity through alternating current is with these 3-line systems, and so that's largely what's done. So this is what's referred to as a single circuit. It's one system conveying power long distances, and having one standing alone is relatively reliable because if you have some kind of hazard that intervenes, an aircraft flying into a line, well, if it's crashing into one and there's another one next door, then it might crash into 2. Or if there's a fire that's affecting one line, it might affect 2 lines. Or if there's an earthquake, or if there's some act of terrorism, it might be easy to get to 2 lines if they're bundled together. So you keep things more reliable by keeping the lines separate. Of course, there's a big trade-off there, because these transmission lines have huge environmental impacts. They not only look gosh awful ugly, but they're, in addition to that, there's a footprint to the tower, so you got to disturb the land there. There are access roads that are built so that people can get to the towers and provide service. So you're scraping off a lot of habitat that way. There's a huge intrusion in the construction process, so there's a lot of pollution, a lot of greenhouse gases emitted, and disturbances to breeding seasons for animals in the area, and all sorts of problems. You don't want to build any more transmission lines than you have to, but your reliability is going to be better if you build them separate from each other. This is a double circuit line. You got those 2 clusters of three lines, and you see a lot of those, even though it causes great pain to people who are concerned about reliability. But there are only so many places you can build transmission lines, and it's more efficient in terms of construction to rely on both sides of these big towers and put lines on there instead of just relying on one. This is where you really get excited about. This is a triple circuit, and it's got 2 sets of lines, and you can imagine how delighted somebody in a helicopter would be looking at that. So that's overhead lines in a very small nutshell. We can also put lines underground. The high-powered lines have to be put in. We haven't talked much about the characteristics of these lines, and I really ought to do that a little bit. Let's look at these 2 lines here. You got the overhead lines, and you got a gorgeous-looking section of an underground line. Now the overhead lines they have to have towers every few hundred feet or whatever, and they have to have the towers pretty high up. Anybody imagine why the towers have to be fairly high? Christopher? That's today, this day and age, we think about the electromagnetic radiation. When they first started building these, no one was really thinking about that or caring about it a lot. Although, it's true that you can go under some high-powered lines with a fluorescent light tube and you can see it light up just from the fields that are floating around in the air, and it can make people a little nervous. So people knew about that, but they didn't think about health effects from it or other dangers. So that could be a factor today. That's a good one. Anything else? Pardon? So trucks can go under, so trees can live under them, so that people can play ball underneath them. Yeah, Eric?
Aren't they loud, too?
They are loud. Yeah. Why do they make noise? What makes noise? Yeah. Something buzzing. This is good. We're doing real well here. Okay. There's one interesting factor here. It's something you may not thought about very often. But you got these big towers, and you got these big lines. Now, are those lines touching the towers? In fact, they are not. Because think about it. If they touch the tower, how do people get electrocuted? People get electrocuted when they touch a live source of electricity and they're grounded. So you're standing on the ground, or you're holding onto a pipe, and the pipe goes into the ground, and current flows through your body when you're connected to something that's grounded, and you're touching live electricity. Well, so if you have these big metal towers, and you had these wires, and the wires were touching the towers, then they would take the current all the way down the tower. All you need to do is go underneath like that, touch it, and you're gone, right? So they couldn't have that happen, right? Also, there would be problems with fires all the time underneath the towers, so you'd have to brush out for huge distances. Problems with lightning strikes hitting the tower and burning the lines, frying everything up. So what they do is they have what's referred to as insulators, and the insulators are touching the tower, but the insulators don't conduct electricity. And so the wires move through the insulators and never touch the tower, right? But what happens is you get all that radiation going, and the insulators start getting loose, and they start rattling, and they make a lot of noise. And you also get snapping noise from arcing electricity when things touch each other at various times. And then the other component is, if you look really carefully at this picture, you'll see a thin wire running across the very top of the tower, and that wire is designed to dissipate any lightning strikes and take the energy from the lightning strike away before it gets down to those wires. So anyway, that's one of the reasons you get a lot of noise from these structures. So you don't want it for that reason. But there's another fundamental factor, and it's tied to this notion of not wanting those wires to be so low that they touch a truck or touch a tree or whatever. What happens as electricity flows through these lines? The energy flows through the lines. Is it an entirely efficient system? Nah. Heat dissipates. And what happens to that heat? What does it do, among other things? Warms up the wires, the cables. And those cables get warmer, they expand. And so you'll always see a bit of a sway between the towers with the lines dipping down. Well, as they get hotter, as they're carrying more power, they start sagging further. So you want to make sure that you've got enough clearance so that when they get to their maximum level of sag, they're still not going to be in a place where they're going to be in harm's way, right? So you have to have these very tall towers. You also have to have fairly big rights of way. You have to set aside some land, usually about 150 feet across for a large AC transmission line. And you can see an access road running through the middle there. You keep that available. And also, within that right-of-way, that's the period where you're going to have the highest level of electromagnetic fields. So you want to keep most uses away from that area. Well, things get a lot simpler in a way when you get to undergrounding, because you can put lines underground. You don't really need to set aside much of a right-of-way. And you don't have the same kind of concern with the wires sagging, but they can still get hot. So how do you deal with that? Well, you have a system with a conduit, and in the conduit you got the wire, but you also have some kind of heat exchange fluid, some fluid that can be pumped through the cables through the conduit and take heat away from the transmission cable and then dissipate it into the air. So to make undergrounding work, you need to dig trenches. You need to have fairly expensive fabricated cable systems. And then you need to have pumping stations, and you need to keep all of that moving all the time. Undergrounding is anywhere from 5 to 10 times more expensive than putting wires above the ground. I love to give the image of Thomas Edison's first installed facility, where basically what he did is he built a little generating unit. He took a couple of poles and stuck them in the ground outside. He tacked some wires up to the poles. He suspended them across to a boarding house, and he tacked the wires on the inside of the boarding house and hung a light in the dining room and put a bulb in it, and that's how he distributed electricity the first time. And that was well over 100 years ago. We haven't gotten much better at it. And so we basically do the same thing with bigger wires, and we've gotten sophisticated enough to take into account the fact we're going to want to have electricity when we build a house, so we put the wires on the other side of the wallpaper. But other than that, it's really the same deal. Why do we do it that way? Because it's cheap. It's a lot cheaper to just run these lines above ground than it is to bury them. There are pros and cons as well. It's not only less expensive, but it's easier to find a problem. I mean, if the line breaks and it's above ground, you go out there and say, well, let's see, that wire's touching the ground, so I think it's broken. If it's an underground line, you don't have that advantage necessarily, and you gotta find some way to locate the place of the repair. Overhead lines, tend to have a lot of problems with storms and with fires and with all sorts of other things that are in the atmosphere. They require large right-of-way, as I told you. They're really hard to put in cities or places where there are suburbs developed. People don't want to look at them. They're concerned about electromagnetic field exposure. And they're easier to adjust. You can move towers later. You can do all sorts of other things as long as you can convince people to have them near their house. With undergrounding lines, they're not only expensive, but they do protect you from a lot of those weather-related hazards we talked about. Hard to find when you need to repair things. You don't need much right-of-way at all, but they're easier to put into congested areas. I'm not going to talk much about this, but about the rest of the material that I have. But basically, there's a tremendous concern about the reliability of the system. One of the things I forgot to mention in terms of the things that were in the news. Earlier in the week, the State Energy Commission, which sets the rules for new construction, for the energy efficiency of new construction, declared that in the future, when you build a house and you're going to have an air conditioner in the house, that you have to install a remote radio-fired remote sensing device, which would allow the utility to turn down your air conditioner when there's too much demand for electricity. Right? Now, from the standpoint of the engineers who were thinking about this thing, it made all the sense in the world. What do you think the public reaction was? Does the term Big Brother come to mind? And people started freaking out. So what is going on here? We're not have government coming into our home and telling us exactly what to use. What that reflects, and something I think we want to invite you to think about more in days ahead, is the fact that the way we run our electric system, we got a wire here. I don't know what this one does, so I could get myself into trouble. But we have wires, and we just know, we demand, we absolutely insist that anytime we go to that switch and flip it, the light's going to go on. Right? It's not, and if it doesn't go on, that's a failure of the system, and we're going to require people to be brought to task for their failure to provide reliable electricity. Reliability is an extremely important factor to us. So how do you keep this whole system going? The image I'd like to offer to you is that the electric grid is really just one giant machine. You got all these generators that have to be cycled in sequence. You have to figure out what your level of demand is. You have to predict your demand. The other term we use for demand is load. We predict what the load is going to be. How much are people going to insist on flipping on those light switches and actually getting some power running through it? And so you figure out the load. You've got all these generating units. You've got the transmission lines. You have to have some redundancy. You have to have some extra in case a line breaks, some extra generators in case a generator goes poof. You've got to have some extra supply there. Somebody's got to manage that whole process and has to form a strategy to make the system work in the event that you lose the largest single component. If a big transmission line goes out, you have to have enough other transmission lines to make things still work. If you lose your largest generating unit, you have to have enough other generation to make the system work. That's referred to often as N-1. And lucky you don't have to hear all of this. But what I guess just want to do is just give you the image, if I can ever find it. Too much stuff here. I'm going to get out of this. Last image I wanted to show you, which is a control room at a power plant. I'm sorry, not a control room, the power plant. Okay. Okay. This is what's known as a central dispatch facility. There are people who sit at the desks in these rooms and make decisions about all of this. You're going to figure out which power plants to turn on, which ones to have ready. When I see you next time, I'll explain a little bit about the strategy for the different kinds of power plants you use and when to use them. So somebody's making decisions about those power plants and how to use these transmission lines and when do they get fully loaded and when do you need to find a time to bring power somewhere else. It's all managed from one central brain. It's one machine. And that's the image I wanted to offer to you. And I can't remember what else I was going to say, so I'll leave it for next time. All right. So, all right. Now, for the readings for next time, as I mentioned, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about economics. How many people studied economics? Oh, thank heavens. All right. So, how many were actually economics majors? Okay. Good. All right. So I'm going to be in trouble with a couple of people because what I want to do is run through some basic terminology and talk about how these concepts are applied to the way people think about regulating electric utilities. And so I'm going to ask you to read a chapter in this book that has graphs in it. It's got some concepts for you to think about. Take time with this. Sit down with a pencil and paper and play with the graphs. Try to think about it a little bit. This will take closer attention than a lot of the other reading that you're going to have to do. There are also a few cases to study for next time, and I'm going to ask people to talk about the cases. And so look them over. And so I think the reading for this next class is probably a little more attentive than some of the others. So it's going to, it'll get a little easier. But put some time and thought into what you have to read for next week. And if you haven't given me this your little form already, please do before you leave. And I still have some more transcripts and copies of the assignments.